Hello, welcome to Nytheric Horror. Tonight, enjoy 3 hours of true scary stories, mysterious encounters, and disturbing experiences. Ads may play during the first 15 minutes and after 2:30,000, with no mid-roll ads in between. Turn off the lights, close your eyes, and let the nightmare begin. I grew up spending most of my weekends at my grandmother's house, but it wasn't until my dad took the house over that I actually moved in and started living there full time. My grandmother had gotten too old and too sick to take care of herself anymore, so she went into a nursing home. And the house just sort of passed down to my dad without much discussion. There wasn't really a family meeting about it or anything formal. It was just one of those things that happened quietly, the way a lot of hard decisions happen in families, where one day somebody mentions it in passing, and a few weeks later it's already done. My grandmother had lived in that house for most of her adult life, decades and decades, long enough that every room still had traces of her in it even after she was gone. Old photographs in cheap frames, doilies on the arms of chairs. A smell that never fully left the walls, no matter how many windows we opened. Nobody in the family really talked about what that house had seen over the years, or what my grandmother used to do in it, until I started living there myself and things started happening that I couldn't explain. Looking back, I think that's fairly common in families like mine. There are stories that get told at holidays, half joking, half serious, and everybody laughs a little too quickly and moves on to the next topic before anyone can ask too many follow-up questions. My grandmother's exorcism story was one of those. It got brought up maybe once or twice a year, usually by an aunt or an uncle trying to get a rise out of the younger cousins, and my grandmother would just nod along like it was the most ordinary thing in the world, confirming details here and there without ever seeming bothered by the memory of it. My grandmother was a deeply religious woman. She went to church every single Sunday without fail, rain or shine, sick or healthy, and she dragged half the family along with her whenever she could manage it. She kept a Bible on almost every table in the house, not just one central family Bible like some households have, but small copies scattered everywhere, in the kitchen, by her bed, on the little table next to the couch where she did her crossword puzzles. She believed, truly and completely believed, in the existence of demons and spirits and the power of prayer to drive them out, not as some abstract religious concept, but as a real, practical, everyday possibility. She talked about spiritual warfare the same way other people talk about the weather, like it was just a fact of life you had to be prepared for. When I was a kid, she used to tell me a story about a neighbor of hers from years and years back, a woman who lived a few houses down the road on the same street. According to my grandmother, this neighbor had started acting strange out of nowhere, not gradually, but suddenly, like a switch had been flipped inside her. She was saying things that didn't sound like her at all, using words and phrases that neighbor never would have used, speaking in a voice that wasn't her own, deeper and rougher than her normal speaking voice, and doing things late at night that scared her own husband and children half to death. My grandmother told me the woman would wander the house at odd hours, standing in doorways without moving, staring at walls for long stretches of time, and once, according to the story, she had been found crouched in a corner of her kitchen, speaking in a language nobody in the family recognized. My grandmother said she went over there one night with her Bible and a bottle of holy water, and she performed what she called an exorcism on this woman, right there in her living room, with the woman's own family standing around watching, too frightened to do anything but pray along with her. She described it in bits and pieces over the years, never the whole story all at once, just fragments here and there, depending on her mood and who was asking. She talked about how the woman's whole body had gone rigid at one point, how her voice had dropped even lower when my grandmother started reading scripture out loud, how the temperature in that living room had dropped so fast that everyone could see their breath, despite it being the middle of summer. I don't know how much of that story was true, and how much of it had been exaggerated over the years, the way old stories tend to get exaggerated in the retelling, picking up small details each time somebody passes it along, but my grandmother swore up and down that it happened exactly the way she told it. Every single time, word for word, and she never once laughed when she told it, which was unusual for her, because she laughed about almost everything else in her life, even things that weren't particularly funny. I moved into that house in 2010 when I was old enough to have my own friends over on a regular basis and stay up as late as I wanted without anyone telling me to go to bed. The house itself was an old one, built long before I was born. The kind of house with creaky wooden floors and thin walls, and a layout that didn't quite make sense by modern standards. Rooms had been added on over the decades in a way that never quite matched the original structure, so hallways ended abruptly. Door frames were slightly crooked, and certain rooms were a few steps lower or higher than you expected them to be. The dining room and the living room were actually the same room, just sort of blending into each other with no wall or clear division between them, and that room connected directly to the kitchen. The kitchen then connected to another room further back that we used as a computer room, a room that had probably been a sewing room or a small den back when my grandmother first moved in, where we kept an old desktop computer that I had loaded up with something like 16 gigabytes of music, which back then felt like an enormous amount. More songs than I could ever listen to in one sitting. That computer room was tucked at the very back of the house, past the kitchen, past a narrow little hallway with a single window that looked out onto the backyard. And it always felt a little separate from the rest of the house, like an afterthought. A room you had to make an effort to walk to, rather than one you passed through on your way to somewhere else. During the day, it didn't feel like anything special. Just a room with a desk and a chair and an old monitor that hummed faintly when it was on. At night, though, especially once everyone else had gone quiet, and it was just the glow of the screen lighting up that narrow hallway, it had a different feeling to it. The kind of feeling you get in a room that's a little too far from everyone else, a little too easy to forget about. Most nights, my friends and I would sit around the dining room table in the front of the house, and we'd let the computer play music from the back room so that it drifted through the kitchen and out into where we were sitting. It became a kind of background hum to our conversations, something we didn't even really pay attention to most of the time, because it was just always there, playing quietly while we talked about nothing in particular, laughed about stupid things that happened during the week, argued over movies, all the ordinary things you do when you're a teenager hanging out at a friend's house on a weekend night. The night I want to tell you about started exactly like every other night we spent in that house. There were 4 or 5 of us sitting around the table. I don't remember the exact number anymore, but enough that the table felt full and the conversation never really died down for long. The lights were on. Nothing was dim or moody about the atmosphere. This wasn't some late-night ghost hunting session where we were trying to scare ourselves on purpose. We were just hanging out. The music from the computer room was playing like it always did, some mix of whatever was on my 16 gigs. Songs bleeding into each other the way a shuffled playlist does. Familiar background noise that none of us were actively listening to. At some point, someone made a joke. I genuinely don't remember what it was about, but it was the kind of joke that gets everyone laughing for a second, and then the room goes quiet right after. The way rooms do when a joke lands, and then there's nothing immediate to follow it up with. In that quiet second, one of my friends looked toward the kitchen and said something like, "Hey, did the music stop?" And we all kind of paused and listened, and sure enough, there was nothing coming from the back room. No music, just silence where there had been sound a minute before. Nobody had gotten up. That's the first thing I want to make clear, because it's the detail that made all of our stomachs drop a little. Nobody had walked back to the computer room, nobody had touched the keyboard or the mouse, nobody had paused anything. We had all been sitting at that table the entire time. And yet, the music, which had been playing continuously in the background for the better part of an hour, had simply stopped without any of us noticing exactly when. We were about to just shrug it off, honestly, the kind of thing you'd chalk up to the program crashing or the playlist ending, when the silence broke into something else entirely. Very quietly at first, so quietly that I almost thought I was imagining it, we heard the sound of footsteps. Not regular footsteps either. High heels. The distinct, sharp click-clack of a woman walking in high-heeled shoes, echoing like she was walking through some kind of alleyway or parking garage, the sound bouncing off unseen walls in a way that made it sound like it was coming from somewhere with hard surfaces and empty space. Somewhere that definitely wasn't a small back room with a desktop computer and a cluttered desk. We all went dead silent at the table. I remember looking around at my friends' faces and seeing the exact same confusion and creeping unease that I was feeling myself. So I knew I wasn't imagining it, and I knew it wasn't just me hearing things. The footsteps were coming from the direction of the kitchen, from the computer room beyond it, getting slightly louder, slightly clearer, like whoever or whatever was walking was getting closer to some invisible microphone. One of us finally said we should go check it out, and honestly, looking back, I don't know why we thought that was a good idea, but curiosity and disbelief will make you do things that seem obviously stupid in hindsight. We got up together, all of us, because none of us wanted to be the one who went alone, and we walked through the kitchen toward the back room where the sound was coming from. When we got to the computer room, the screen was lit up with a screensaver, the default one that kicks in after a certain period of no activity on the mouse or keyboard. That detail mattered to us immediately, because it meant nobody had been using the computer recently enough to keep the screensaver from activating, and it also meant that whatever was making that footstep sound, it wasn't a person physically standing there typing or clicking. The desk chair was empty. The room was empty. There was nobody there. The footsteps kept going, clicking along steadily, and then they started to speed up, like the woman wearing those heels had broken into a run. And then, without any warning at all, a scream tore through the speakers. Not a startled little yelp, not a movie sound effect that felt distant or fake. It was a full, gut-wrenching, bloody murder scream. The kind of sound that makes the hair on your arm stand straight up because some primal part of your brain recognizes it as real terror, even filtered through cheap computer speakers. All of us jumped back from the doorway of that room like we'd touched something hot. And then, right as the scream cut off, before any of us could even process what we had just heard, the Ghostbusters theme song started playing. I mean that literally. The actual Ghostbusters theme, the one everybody knows, with the "Who You Gonna Call" refrain, blasting out of the speakers right after that scream, like some kind of sick punchline to a joke none of us had told. One of my friends actually laughed, this short, nervous, disbelieving laugh, because it was so absurd, so perfectly timed, that it almost didn't feel real. It felt like something was messing with us on purpose, like whatever had made that woman scream was now taunting us, mocking the fact that we'd been sitting around treating the house casually, the way you'd mock someone for whistling past a graveyard. We moved the mouse to wake the screen up fully, and one of us clicked over to check what program was actually running, what had caused all of this. iTunes was open. That part wasn't surprising, since that's what I used to play my music library, but iTunes was paused, not playing. Paused There was a track sitting there, stopped, not actively producing any sound, and yet we had all just heard, clear as day, footsteps, a scream, and a full theme song play through those speakers. We checked for any internet browser tabs that might have been open, thinking maybe some video had auto-played from a website. But there was nothing. No browser was even running. The desktop itself was clean. Nothing unusual sitting on it. No downloaded audio files that would explain what we just heard. And I want to be very clear about this part, because it's the detail that stuck with me the most afterward. I did not have the Ghostbusters theme song anywhere on that computer. It wasn't part of my 16 gigs of music. I had never downloaded it, never had a reason to. It simply did not exist anywhere on that hard drive as far as any of us could find when we went looking that night, and even in the days after. We stood there in that back room for a long time after that, nobody really wanting to be the one to say what we were all thinking, which was that something in that house had just made noise come out of a paused program, noise that included sound effects and a licensed song that didn't exist on the computer, timed perfectly to scare the hell out of a group of teenagers who had, admittedly, been sitting around ignoring the house and treating it like nothing more than a place to hang out. If there was something there, it felt less like it was trying to hurt us and more like it was trying to get our attention. Or maybe punishing us a little for not paying it any mind, playing along with our disrespect in its own twisted way before flipping the joke back onto us. That wasn't the only strange thing that happened in that house, not by a long shot, but it was the one that stuck with all of us the hardest. Probably because there were multiple witnesses, and because it was so specific and so impossible to explain away with a simple technical glitch. I should mention another incident, one that happened before that night with the music, back when the power had gone out in the house during a storm. It was somewhere around 2 or 3 in the morning, the whole house dark, no electricity running to anything, and yet an alarm clock in one of the back bedrooms went off at full volume, blaring through the silent house like it was any normal morning. There was no electricity. The clock shouldn't have been able to do anything at all, let alone sound an alarm loud enough to wake up half the house. My dad went and checked it himself, unplugged and everything, batteries dead inside it too, and there was simply no explanation for how it had gone off. Living in that house after that, you started to notice things differently. Lights would flicker in rooms where nobody was standing near a switch. You'd hear footsteps upstairs when you knew for a fact that everyone in the house was downstairs together. Doors that had been left open would be found shut, and doors that had been shut would be found standing wide open, with nobody around to have moved them. We started calling these things our regular hauntings, almost like they became a normal part of living there, something you got used to the way you get used to a floorboard that always creaks in the same spot. But that night, with the footsteps and the scream and the Ghostbusters song, that one was different. That one felt intentional in a way the others didn't. That one felt like whatever was in that house wanted us to know beyond any doubt that it was there, that it had been listening to us the whole time, and that it had its own sense of humor about being ignored. I think about my grandmother's story sometimes, the one about the exorcism she said she performed on her neighbor all those years before we ever lived in that house. I don't know if there's any connection between that old story and what happened to us, whether something followed her home that night, or whether the house had always had something living in it long before my grandmother ever set foot inside. Something that had simply been waiting patiently for a group of loud, careless teenagers to finally notice it was there. All I know for certain is what we heard that night, standing frozen in that kitchen doorway, listening to heels clicking on a floor that wasn't there, a scream that came from nowhere and everywhere at once, and a song that shouldn't have existed on that computer playing right afterward like some kind of twisted applause. We never did figure out a normal explanation for it. We looked. We genuinely tried, because none of us wanted to believe what our own ears had just told us was true. We checked every program running in the background, every audio file on the hard drive, every possible source that could have produced those sounds, and we came up with nothing every single time. Eventually, we just stopped looking, because some part of all of us understood that we weren't going to find an answer that made sense in any normal, rational way, and that maybe some things are better left as an open question than pushed and pushed until you get an answer you really don't want. In the weeks after that night, none of us really talked about it much when we were apart from each other, but whenever we were all back together in that house, it hung over the room a little, an unspoken thing that changed how we acted around the place. We stopped leaving the computer to play music by itself in the background while we sat somewhere else. If someone wanted to listen to something, they went and sat in that room with it. Or they turned it off entirely and we just talked without any music at all. Nobody ever said out loud that this was a rule, but it became one anyway. The kind of quiet agreement a group of friends reaches without ever having a real conversation about it, just through the way everyone starts behaving the same way at the same time. My dad noticed the change in us too, though we never explained the full story to him in detail. Not really. We told him some vague version of it, that something weird had happened with the computer, that we'd heard something we couldn't explain, and he just nodded along the way parents do when they don't fully believe something but don't want to dismiss their kids either. He'd grown up in that house himself, back when my grandmother was younger and the exorcism story was still fresh instead of decades old, and I think some small part of him already expected that house to have its own strange history, its own things living inside the walls that nobody talked about directly. He never seemed shocked when we brought up odd occurrences. If anything, he seemed almost resigned to it, like it was simply a fact about the house he had learned to live around a long time ago, the same way you learn to live around a step that always creaks, or a door that never quite latches shut on the first try. I don't live in that house anymore. None of my family does now. It changed hands again after a while, sold off to people outside the family who had no idea about my grandmother's exorcism story, or the alarm clock that rang with no power, or the night the computer played a woman's death and a movie theme song right after it, like some kind of cruel joke meant only for us. Sometimes I drive past that street when I'm in the area visiting relatives, and I slow down just enough to look at the house from the road, noting the small changes the new owners have made. A different color on the shutters, a new fence around the yard, small, ordinary changes that make it look like a completely different place from the one I grew up hearing about and eventually lived in myself. But the bones of it are still the same house, the same walls that heard my grandmother's prayers all those years ago, the same back room where a paused computer somehow played sounds it had no business playing. I sometimes wonder if the new owners have ever heard footsteps they can't explain, or found a light on in a room where they know for certain they turned it off, or felt that particular kind of silence settle over a room right before something impossible happens. I wonder if they've ever sat around a table with friends, let some music play quietly in another room, and then noticed all of a sudden that it had gone quiet without anyone getting up to stop it. I hope, for their sake, that whatever was in that house decided to stay behind when we finally left it, that it found some kind of peace, or lost interest, or simply faded the way some of these things eventually do over time. But knowing what I know now, knowing how patient it seemed, how deliberate its timing was, how much it seemed to enjoy the reaction it got out of a group of kids who had spent months treating its home like nothing more than background noise, I have a hard time believing it just let us walk away, clean. I think about that scream sometimes, even now, all these years later. Not the Ghostbusters song, which honestly became almost funny to us after enough time had passed. Something we'd bring up at parties as this wild story that nobody quite believed, but the scream itself. There was something in the specific quality of it, the rawness of it, that didn't sound like a sound effect pulled from some generic horror movie library. It sounded like a real woman, in real terror, caught in the middle of something none of us could see or understand, frozen forever in that one moment, and replayed for us that night as some kind of message, or warning, or maybe just proof that it was there, watching us the whole time we thought we were alone in that house, listening to us laugh and joke and pay it no mind at all. I think it's still there, waiting the same way it waited before, patient in a way that only something without a body and without the pressure of time can afford to be, waiting for someone new to stop listening so it can remind them all over again exactly whose house it really is. Let me say up front that I have only told this story to 3 people in my entire life. And even then, I only told them because I trusted them enough not to think I'd completely lost my mind. It's not the kind of thing you bring up casually, not the kind of story that fits into normal conversation, and for years I've carried it around, mostly in silence, turning it over privately in my own head far more often than I've ever spoken it out loud. Almost 5 years ago now, though the details of that evening have stayed sharper in my memory than most things that happened even more recently, I was out fishing on my grandmother's pasture land in south central Kansas. Several hundred acres that had been in the family long enough that I knew nearly every corner of it by heart. Or at least I thought I did until that night. There's a spot out there, tucked into a fairly wooded section of the property, where a small dam creates a modest waterfall along the creek. The kind of place that always felt a little more alive than the open pasture around it, shaded and cooler, with a constant sound of moving water covering up most other noise. My grandmother has owned that land my entire life, and then some. Several hundred acres that have been passed down through the family, most of it open pasture used for grazing cattle over the years, but that one wooded stretch along the creek had always felt different from the rest of the property, set apart somehow, cooler under the tree canopy even on the hottest summer afternoons, with a kind of stillness to it that made you lower your voice without really meaning to. I'd fished that stretch more times than I could count over the years, going all the way back to when I was a kid, tagging along with my dad and uncles on weekend trips out to the pasture, learning where the fish liked to hold up in the deeper pools below the dam, learning the sound the water made pouring over that little waterfall at different times of year, depending on how much rain we'd had. I knew the bends in the creek, knew the fallen logs and the rock ledges, knew the path well enough that I usually didn't even need much light to find my way back to where I'd parked. That evening, though, everything about the walk back would end up feeling different, colored permanently by what happened right before I started it, turning a place I'd known my whole life into somewhere I could never quite feel fully comfortable in again. Not the same way I used to. It was just getting dark. That specific window of evening where the light hasn't fully gone, but everything starts taking on a deeper, more shadowed quality. Colors muting out into shades of gray and blue before true darkness sets in. I'd been walking the creek most of the afternoon, working my way along the water, and by that point I'd drifted a good mile or more from where I'd left my truck, further than I usually wandered. But the fishing had been good enough that I kept telling myself, just one more bend, just one more hole. The way you do when the bite is on and you don't want to be the one who calls it, quits too early. I was just about ready to wrap up for the evening, already thinking about the walk back and whether I'd make it to the truck before full dark set in, When I hooked into a decent-sized bass, solid weight on the line, the kind of fish that makes you forget for a minute that you were even thinking about heading home. I worked him in carefully, enjoying that last bit of fight before I finally got him up to the bank, admired him for a second the way you do, and then bent down to release him back into the water, since I wasn't planning on keeping fish that evening anyway. It was right as I was crouched there, easing that bass back into the current and watching him kick off into deeper water, that something caught my eye on the other side of the creek. I straightened up slowly, still holding my rod, water dripping off my hands, and looked across the water toward whatever had drawn my attention, half expecting a deer or maybe a raccoon making its way down to drink. Something ordinary that my eyes had just barely caught out of my peripheral vision. The light at that point had faded enough that colors were starting to lose their edges, everything shifting toward gray and blue, the kind of half-light where your eyes have to work a little harder to resolve shapes, where you sometimes talk yourself into seeing things that aren't there, and other times fail to notice things that very much are. What I actually saw standing there across that creek was nothing I had any frame of reference for at all. Nothing that matched any animal I'd ever encountered on that property or anywhere else in my life. And no trick of fading light could account for the clarity with which I registered exactly how wrong its proportions were. It stood maybe 4 feet tall at the absolute most, small in stature, but not in any way that read as harmless or unthreatening once I actually took in the full shape of it. Its skin, if that's even the right word for whatever covered its body, was gray and pale, with a sickly quality to the color that reminded me uncomfortably of something that had spent too long without sunlight, or something that simply wasn't built the way living things around here are built. The best comparison I've ever been able to come up with, and I've tried many times over the years to find better words for it, is that its head looked something like a hairless cat, that same general shape and proportion. The ears, the set of the eyes, but attached to a body that was unmistakably more human in its structure, thin but somehow strong-looking, wiry in a way that suggested real physical capability packed into that small, strange frame. The arms hung a little too long at its sides, I remember that distinctly, longer than they should have been relative to the rest of it, and there was something about the way it stood, weight balanced evenly, that made it look ready to move in any direction at any moment, despite the stillness of the pose. It was standing there, looking directly at me. And I want to be clear about how deliberate that gaze felt, because it wasn't the startled, alert stillness of an animal that's just noticed a human nearby and is deciding whether to bolt. It felt intentional, focused, the kind of look you'd give someone if they'd just walked in on something they weren't supposed to see, like I had caught it in the middle of existing in a way it hadn't planned on being witnessed. There was an unmistakable sense radiating off it, even across the width of that creek, that I had made some kind of mistake just by being there, just by looking at it, that I had seen something I had no business seeing. I remember thinking, even in the middle of all that fear, that it seemed almost offended by my presence, if that makes any sense at all, like I'd trespassed somewhere I shouldn't have without ever knowing the boundary existed. Its head began to rock slowly from side to side while it stared at me. An odd, almost rhythmic motion that I've struggled for years to describe accurately. It wasn't quite the confused head tilt you sometimes see in a dog trying to understand a sound, and it wasn't the twitchy, alert movement of a startled animal either. If anything, it looked almost like it was dancing, some slow, deliberate swaying that had nothing to do with confusion or alarm, more like a kind of unhurried, almost performative movement that made the whole scene feel even less like anything natural I'd ever witnessed out there. I stood completely still for what felt like a long stretch of time, my mind racing through every possible explanation, every animal native to that part of Kansas that might somehow, in bad light, from a distance, across a creek, account for what I was looking at. I couldn't come up with a single one. Nothing about the shape, the size, the proportions, or that unnervingly deliberate stare matched anything I knew to actually exist out there. And I've spent enough time on that land, hunting and fishing since I was a kid, to know the wildlife fairly well. I felt threatened. I want to be honest about that, because I think it's important to the rest of what happened. This wasn't some sense of wonder or curiosity at encountering something unexplainable. It was a raw, immediate sense of danger, the kind that settles into your body before your conscious mind has even finished processing what you're looking at. Some ancient survival instinct recognizing something wrong long before logic catches up. My hand started moving on its own, slow and careful, toward the fillet knife I always carried clipped to my belt when I was out fishing. Useful for cleaning fish, but suddenly feeling like the only real defense I had out there, a mile from my truck, with dusk settling in fast around me. I kept my eyes locked on it the entire time, terrified that looking away even for a second, even to glance down and confirm my hand had actually found the knife, might give it whatever opening it needed to close that distance between us before I was ready. The creek between us wasn't especially wide at that point, narrow enough that I found myself calculating, almost without meaning to, how many steps it would take something with legs like that to cross it if it decided to come at me instead of just standing there watching. My fingers found the handle, and I worked it free of its sheath slowly, trying not to make any sudden movement that might provoke whatever reaction that creature was capable of, every second stretching out longer than it had any right to, my whole body locked into that same kind of stillness animals go into right before something happens. That held breath moment where everything hangs in the balance. The second I had that knife fully in hand, blade free, it let out a sound unlike anything I have ever heard before or since, and unlike anything I sincerely hope to ever hear again for as long as I live. It was loud, far louder than something that size should have been physically capable of producing, and it was extremely high-pitched, piercing in a way that seemed to cut straight through the ordinary evening sounds of the creek and the wind in the trees around us. A sound that felt like it bypassed my ears entirely and went straight into some older, more primal part of my brain. I couldn't tell you if it was a scream, a call, some kind of warning, or just an expression of alarm at seeing that knife come out. All I know is that the second that sound finished tearing through the air, the creature took off into the trees on its side of the creek, moving with a speed that seemed completely disproportionate to its small size, gone from sight almost before my mind had fully registered that it had started running at all, covering ground in a way that made the earlier stillness feel like it had all been some kind of deliberate deception, a coiled readiness I hadn't fully appreciated until it finally released. I stood there on that bank for a long time afterward, knife still gripped tight in my hand, straining to hear any further sound of movement in the trees where it had disappeared, my heart hammering hard enough that I could feel it in my ears over the steady rush of the waterfall nearby. Nothing came. No more sound, no more movement, nothing except the ordinary noise of the creek and the wind, like the whole encounter had simply been erased the moment it ended, leaving no trace behind except the memory now lodged permanently in my mind, and the fishing rod I'd apparently dropped at some point without even noticing, lying forgotten in the grass at my feet. The walk back to my truck that evening was one of the longest walks of my life, even though it covered the same mile of familiar ground I'd walked plenty of times before without a second thought. Every shadow along that creek bank looked different to me on the way back, Every rustle of wind through the brush made me spin around fast, knife still in hand the entire way, half convinced that creature, or something like it, was tracking me from just out of sight, waiting for the right moment. I found myself walking faster than I probably needed to, checking behind me every few dozen steps, my mind running through every worst-case scenario it could conjure up, picturing that thing pacing me silently through the trees on the far side of the creek, keeping just enough distance to stay hidden while it decided what to do next. I didn't relax even slightly until I had that truck door shut and locked behind me. Engine running, headlights cutting through the deepening dark toward the gravel road that would take me back off my grandmother's land, hands still shaking on the steering wheel the entire drive home. In the weeks after it happened, I spent more nights than I'd like to admit sitting up late, searching around online, trying to find anything that might match what I'd seen, some kind of documented account from someone else that could help me make sense of it, or at least confirm I wasn't the only person who'd ever run into something like that. I found plenty of stories about strange creatures reported in wooded areas and near water across different parts of the country. Some of them describing things with vaguely similar features, pale skin, unusual proportions, and unsettling human quality to their movement. None of them matched exactly, and I came away from all that searching without ever finding an account that felt like it was describing the same thing I'd seen, but the sheer number of similar stories out there, from people who had no reason to know each other and no way to have coordinated their descriptions, left me with an uneasy feeling that I genuinely hadn't been the only one, that whatever I encountered that evening might have shown itself to other people in other places over the years, most of whom probably kept quiet about it for the same reasons I did. I also spent a fair amount of time afterward going back over old family stories in my head, things I'd half listened to as a kid without really paying attention. Offhand comments from older relatives about strange happenings out on that land going back generations. My grandmother herself had mentioned once, years before any of this happened to me, something about lights and sounds near that same creek bottom that she'd never fully explained, brushing it off at the time as old nonsense not worth repeating. I never worked up the courage to ask her directly about it after my own encounter, worried about what it would mean if she had more to say than I was prepared to hear. Worried equally that pressing her on it might make the whole thing feel even more real and permanent than it already did in my own mind. Some questions, I've decided, are easier left unasked, even when curiosity gnaws at you late at night. The third person I eventually told about all of this, years after it happened, was someone I met through work who had grown up in a different part of rural Kansas entirely. Someone with no connection to my family or that land at all. I brought it up carefully, almost testing the waters, expecting the same kind of polite skepticism I'd gotten from my cousin. Instead, he went quiet for a moment, and then told me, in a low voice like he didn't fully want to say it out loud either, about something similar an uncle of his had described from decades earlier, out near a different creek in a different county. A small, pale creature with an oddly human shape that had let out a piercing scream before disappearing into brush. Hearing that account, so far removed from my own family and my own land, description matching close enough to send a chill through me even sitting in an ordinary break room under fluorescent lights, did more to convince me I hadn't imagined the whole thing than almost anything else that's happened since that evening at the creek. I never saw the creature itself again after that night. Not on that property or anywhere else, despite continuing to fish that same stretch of creek plenty of times in the years since. Though I'll admit I've never again stayed out quite as late as I did that particular evening. But I have heard things from other people over the years. Secondhand stories from family and a few others who spend time out on that land about strange lights they've seen down near that same dam and waterfall after dark. Lights that don't match anything explainable. that move in ways ordinary lights shouldn't move, drifting between the trees or hovering low over the water in a way that flashlights and headlights never do. I never told any of them what I'd actually seen when they brought up their own stories, mostly out of fear of being laughed at or written off as someone whose imagination had gotten the better of him out there in the dark. It's one thing to hear about strange lights secondhand and nod along politely, maybe even offer up some halfway plausible explanation involving swamp gas or reflections off the water. It's another thing entirely to admit you stood across a creek from something with a face like that, staring back at you with what felt unmistakably like intention, like awareness, like you had caught it doing something it very much did not want to be caught doing. The three people I have told over the years all reacted differently, and I've thought a lot about those reactions since, turning them over the same way I turn over the memory of the creature itself. One of them, an old friend I've known since childhood, just went quiet for a long moment after I finished talking. Then admitted that his own grandfather used to tell stories about strange things seen out in the wooded creek bottoms of that same county. Stories he'd always assumed were just old-timers passing down tall tales the way rural families do, embellished a little more with each retelling until nobody could say for certain where the truth ended and the exaggeration began. Hearing that didn't exactly comfort me, but it did make me feel slightly less alone in it, less like the only person who'd ever seen something out there that didn't belong. Another person I told, a cousin who spends almost as much time out on that land as I do, just laughed it off entirely, chalked it up to bad light and an overactive imagination working on a tired mind after a long day of fishing. The kind of dismissal I'd honestly expected from most people, and had braced myself for before I even started talking. I didn't push back much when he laughed. There didn't seem to be any point in arguing over something I couldn't prove to him any more than I could prove it to myself in any way that would hold up under real scrutiny. I know that most people hearing this story, if I ever told it more widely than the handful of people I already have, wouldn't believe a word of it. I understand that completely, and honestly, if someone told me this same story cold, without me having lived through it myself, I'm not sure I'd fully believe it either. It sounds impossible, even to me sometimes. Even now, all these years later, when I try to explain it out loud instead of just replaying it silently in my own head, the way I usually do. Turning it over during quiet moments when nothing else is occupying my attention. The way you turn over anything that never quite got resolved. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes with carrying an experience like this. Knowing that most of the people you'd normally turn to for reassurance or perspective would look at you differently afterward, would wonder, even if they never said it out loud, whether you'd finally cracked under the weight of too much time alone in the woods. But I know what I saw that evening standing on that creek bank as the light was fading. And I know exactly how it felt to have that thing's eyes locked on mine, its head swaying slowly from side to side like it was studying me, deciding something about me. Before it finally let out that sound and vanished into the trees, and no amount of secondhand skepticism from people who weren't standing on that bank with me has ever managed to talk me out of what I know I experienced. I still fish that same stretch of creek on my grandmother's property from time to time, because I love the place too much to let one strange evening keep me away from it entirely, and because some part of me refuses to let whatever that was take away a place that means as much to my family as that land does. But I don't fish it the way I used to. I keep a much closer eye on the light now, making sure I'm well on my way back to the truck before it gets anywhere near as dark as it was that night. No longer willing to push for just one more bend or one more hole the way I once did without a second thought. And I never, under any circumstances, go out there anymore without a gun on me. Something I never used to think twice about before. Back when the worst thing I expected to run into out there was a territorial raccoon or maybe a coyote passing through at dusk. Now I carry it every single time. Not because I expect to ever see that creature again, but because some part of me knows that if I ever do, I want to have more than just a fillet knife between us this time. And because the alternative, going back out there unprepared and unarmed, isn't something I'm willing to risk twice in one lifetime. My family knows I carry it now, and most of them just assume it's ordinary caution. The same reasoning plenty of people around here have for keeping a firearm nearby out in rural country. Snakes and coyotes and the occasional feral hog being reason enough on their own. I've never corrected that assumption. It's easier to let them believe that than to explain the actual reason. Easier to let the gun be about ordinary wildlife than about a 4-foot-tall gray creature with a face like a hairless cat that once stood across a creek from me, studying me like I'd interrupted something private, before letting out a scream I still hear sometimes in the quiet moments right before sleep. My roommate and I were having a genuinely difficult time finding a new place to live. Our lease on the old apartment had already run out, and we'd managed to stretch our welcome there an entire extra month past what we were technically allowed, relying on a landlord who was more patient than he probably needed to be while we scrambled to find somewhere new. The rental market in our area at the time was rough. Everything either too expensive or already snatched up before we could even get a viewing scheduled, and the pressure of needing to find somewhere fast was starting to wear on both of us in that particular way that makes you willing to overlook red flags you'd normally take more seriously. Then we found this place, and it seemed almost too good to be true given everything we'd been dealing with up to that point. It was a huge house, far bigger than either of us had any real need for, with giant rooms that felt almost empty even once we'd moved our furniture in. High ceilings, a big garden out back that had clearly once been someone's pride and joy, even if it had gone a little wild in recent years. It was close to both our jobs, an easy commute for each of us in opposite directions, which felt like an almost impossible stroke of luck given how spread out the city was. And because the place was a little rundown, we managed to negotiate a lower rent than we'd been expecting to pay for something with that much space, which sealed the deal for both of us without much additional discussion needed. The owner explained that they were in the middle of fixing the place up, that they'd already handled the big functional stuff, replacing every appliance in the kitchen and laundry room with brand new units that still had that faint chemical smell of fresh manufacturing, upgrading the plumbing and some of the electrical, but that the aesthetic work hadn't caught up yet. They were happy to let us move in early while they continued renovating around us. An arrangement that worked out well for both sides, given how desperate we were for somewhere to live and how much they seemed to want tenants in the house while they worked on it. Someone there to keep an eye on things and make it feel occupied rather than sitting empty during construction. The state of the place when we first walked through it was honestly a little startling, even with the warning that it needed work. The floors throughout most of the house were nasty, worn and stained in ways that suggested decades of use without much attention paid to upkeep. The wallpaper in nearly every room was old and dirty, peeling in some corners, patterned in styles that had clearly been chosen many decades earlier and never updated since. Faded florals and dated stripes curling away from the wall in long strips that revealed patches of discolored plaster underneath. Everything had a layer of grime and neglect over it, the kind that comes from years of a home not being properly cared for rather than just simple age. Dust settled thick into corners and along baseboards. Windows clouded enough that the daylight coming through them felt dimmer than it should have. There was old furniture scattered throughout, heavy, outdated pieces that needed to be hauled out before we could even think about bringing our own things in. Furniture that felt like it belonged to someone else's life entirely. Left behind and forgotten, sagging armchairs and a dining table with water stains ringed deep into the wood. Honestly, walking through those rooms for the first time, before any of the strange things started happening, it already felt like walking through the set of a horror film. The kind of atmosphere that makes your skin prickle a little even when you know there's nothing actually wrong. Just old dust and shadows and rooms that have seen more than they're telling you. We spent that first weekend after signing the agreement hauling boxes in from the moving truck, both of us commenting more than once on just how big the place actually felt once we were inside it properly. How our footsteps seemed to echo a little in the emptier rooms in a way that our old, cramped apartment had never allowed for. Voices carrying oddly down the hallways in a way that took some getting used to. The garden out back, even overgrown and neglected as it was, had good bones to it. Old rose bushes gone wild along one fence line. A stone path half swallowed by grass leading toward what might have once been a small sitting area. A stone bird bath tipped on its side near the back fence that we kept meaning to write and never quite got around to during those first busy weeks. We joked, half seriously, about how much potential the place had once it got fixed up properly, neither of us dwelling too much yet on just how unsettling some of those empty, grimy rooms felt once the sun started going down and we were the only two people rattling around inside all that space. The size of the house that had felt so exciting during our first daytime walkthrough, taking on a different quality entirely once darkness settled in around us. My roommate had somewhere else to be that first night we officially had access to the house. His girlfriend at the time, and he ended up staying over at her place instead of spending that first night in our new, still mostly empty, and still very run-down new home. I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured I'd just get a head start on unpacking a few boxes, get a feel for the place on my own, and have things a little more settled by the time he joined me the next day. That first night, alone in the house, turned out to be one of the strangest nights of my life, though I didn't fully appreciate just how strange until the pattern of it kept repeating over the following weeks. From almost the moment the sun went down, I had this persistent nagging feeling of being watched, the kind of sensation that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up even when a quick glance around confirms there's obviously nobody else in the room with you. I kept getting chills running across my body throughout the evening, sudden and unexplained. The kind that come and go without any obvious trigger. No draft, no temperature change I could point to as the cause. I remember sitting on the floor of the living room surrounded by half-unpacked boxes, trying to distract myself with my phone and catching myself glancing up toward the darkened hallway more than once, certain for just a second that something had moved at the edge of my vision, only to find nothing there every single time I actually looked directly at it. I eventually went to bed, though calling what followed actual sleep feels generous in hindsight. I fell in and out of consciousness all night long, never settling into anything deep or restful, surfacing again and again throughout those long hours in a way that left me feeling almost more exhausted by morning than I had been when I first lay down. It was the middle of winter outside, cold enough that I'd piled on extra blankets before getting into bed. And yet, somehow, I spent the entire night feeling hot and sweaty, uncomfortably warm in a way that made no sense given the actual temperature in the room, kicking blankets off only to pull them back on minutes later when the heat gave way to sudden chills again. My skin felt itchy in a way I couldn't quite locate or scratch away, an all-over irritation that seemed to shift positions every time I tried to address it, moving from my arms to my back to the soles of my feet like something was testing different spots. And more than once throughout that long, restless night, I felt like something was pinching me, small, sharp sensations across different parts of my body. The kind of thing you'd normally dismiss as a muscle twitch or a stray insect. Except it kept happening, over and over, in different spots, all through the night. Sharp enough each time to jolt me a little further out of whatever thin sleep I'd managed to find. The dream, or at least what I remember of it as a dream, has stayed with me in more detail than most dreams ever do. Sharp and specific in a way that feels different from the usual haze that dreams fade into by morning. I dreamed about an old woman standing somewhere in the room, dressed in a white nightgown, simply staring at me, without moving, without speaking, just watching from wherever she was positioned. As the night went on, in whatever strange dream logic was governing that repeated vision, she got closer and closer to where I lay. Incremental movements between each time the dream resumed, like something was slowly closing the distance between us across the span of that long night. I finally woke up for good, fully and completely, because it felt like someone had grabbed onto my ankles, a sharp physical sensation of pressure and grip that yanked me out of sleep with my heart already pounding before I had even had a chance to process what had happened. I lay there afterward in the dark, breathing hard, staring toward the foot of the bed, half expecting to see something actually standing there, even though every rational part of my mind insisted that couldn't possibly be the case. There was nothing there, of course, just the ordinary shapes of my still mostly unfamiliar room in the dark, boxes I hadn't unpacked, yet stacked against one wall, the old dresser that had come with the house standing in its corner, its outline barely visible in the faint light coming through the curtains. But the feeling of that grip on my ankle stayed with me long after I'd confirmed there was nothing physically there, a phantom pressure that took a long time to fully fade. One I found myself absently rubbing at with my other foot for several minutes before I finally worked up the nerve to try closing my eyes again. The next morning, still shaken and running on almost no real sleep, our next-door neighbors came by to introduce themselves. An older couple who'd apparently been keeping half an eye on the house and were curious about the new tenants who'd moved in. They told us they'd lived in their own home for about 60 years at that point, long enough to have watched our house go through decades of history that neither my roommate nor I had any way of knowing about on our own. Over the course of that conversation, standing out on the front walk in the cold morning air, they filled us in on the history of the place we'd just moved into, and it was not the kind of history that made me feel any better about that first restless night. They explained that the woman who'd lived there previously, a distant relative of the current owner who was now fixing the place up, had lived in that house for almost her entire life. The house itself had been in the family for roughly 100 years, built generations back and passed down through the family line. This particular woman, having spent decades of her own life within those same walls before her death, raising her own children there, watching the neighborhood change and grow up around her, while the house itself stayed largely the same. Our neighbors talked about her fondly at first, describing a woman who used to keep that garden immaculate in her younger years, who hosted small gatherings on the porch during warmer months, who was known up and down the street for her kindness in the decades before her health started declining. According to our neighbors, the last 10 years or so of her life had been spent under the care of a private nurse, someone hired to look after her as her health declined with age and she could no longer fully manage on her own. From what our neighbors described, that arrangement had not gone well at all. They said the nurse had evidently taken horrible care of the house itself during that time, letting the maintenance and cleanliness slide badly, which lined up uncomfortably well with the grimy, neglected state we'd found the place in when we first moved through it. The wallpaper and floors bearing the marks of a full decade of neglect that had never been addressed. Worse than the neglect of the house, though, was what they implied, and in some cases stated outright, about the treatment of the woman herself during those final years, hints of a caretaker who hadn't treated her elderly charge with the dignity or care someone in that position should have provided, mentioning things they'd noticed over the fence line. Curtains that stayed drawn for weeks at a time. A woman they used to wave to regularly who simply stopped appearing outside at all during those last years, and the way the whole property had seemed to grow quieter and more withdrawn with each passing season. The woman had ultimately died in that house, in her own bed. And since, there was a large, heavy bed already sitting in what had become my bedroom when we divided up the rooms, clearly too old and too big to have been worth moving out during the partial renovation so far. I couldn't help but assume that was very likely the exact spot where she'd taken her last breath. In the same room where I'd just spent a night, dreaming about an old woman in white slowly creeping closer across the floor toward where I lay. I didn't sleep especially well for a while after hearing that story, and I noticed my roommate seemed a little unsettled by it too when I relayed the conversation to him later that day, though neither of us said much about it directly at first, both of us maybe hoping that not talking about it too much would keep whatever unease we felt from growing into something bigger. We fell into this unspoken habit over the following weeks of mentioning strange occurrences to each other only in passing, almost casually, like bringing it up too seriously would somehow make it more real than either of us was ready to fully accept. It wasn't until several weeks in, after enough of these small incidents had piled up between us, that we finally sat down one evening and actually talked through everything openly, comparing notes on the unlocked door, the footsteps we'd each separately assumed the other was making, the porch sounds at night. Saying it all out loud together, laid out in one conversation instead of scattered across separate offhand comments, made the whole pattern feel a lot more significant than either of us had been willing to admit up to that point. Weird things continued happening around that house for the next month or so, a steady stream of small, individually explainable but collectively unsettling occurrences that neither of us ever fully got used to. My roommate and I would each, on separate occasions, hear the other one waking up early in the morning, making the ordinary sounds of someone starting their day. Cabinets opening and closing in the kitchen, the clatter of dishes, footsteps moving around downstairs, sometimes even the specific sound of the coffee maker gurgling through its cycle. One of us would eventually get up to see what the other was doing this early, only to find them still fast asleep in their own room, completely undisturbed, having never left their bed at all, completely unaware that any sound had ever come from the kitchen or anywhere else in the house. We compared notes on this enough times over that first month that it stopped feeling like a coincidence to either of us, both of us having independently experienced the exact same thing on different mornings without ever discussing it beforehand. I would come home some days and find my bedroom door unlocked, even though I distinctly remembered locking it before leaving that morning. A habit I'd been careful about, specifically because that particular door opened directly out onto the back patio. An entry point that felt worth securing, given how easy it would have been for someone to walk right up to it from outside. Finding it standing unlocked, again and again over the course of that month, always left me with an uneasy feeling I couldn't fully shake, even when I tried to convince myself I'd simply forgotten to lock it that particular morning. A rationalization that got harder to maintain every time it happened again, sometimes twice in the same week. Always on days I could have sworn I'd double-checked it before leaving. Random things around the house would get misplaced without any clear explanation. Items I was certain I'd left in one spot turning up somewhere else entirely. Small enough occurrences on their own that I could usually talk myself into believing I'd simply misremembered where I'd set something down. But frequent enough as a pattern that the excuse started wearing thin the longer we lived there. Keys would turn up in a different room than where I always kept them. A book I'd left on the nightstand would somehow end up on the kitchen counter days later, with neither my roommate nor I having any memory of moving it there. And at night, more than a few times, I'd hear what sounded unmistakably like someone walking back and forth along the porch outside, slow, deliberate footsteps pacing the length of it, pausing occasionally before starting up again, even though checking never once revealed anyone actually out there. The porch empty and undisturbed every single time I worked up the nerve to look. None of these individual things were dramatic enough on their own to send either of us running for the door, and I think that's part of what made it easier to keep living there, despite everything. The fact that each strange occurrence was small enough to explain away individually, even while the accumulated pattern of them made the house feel increasingly less like an empty space we happened to be. Renting and more like somewhere we were sharing with something else entirely. Eventually, over the following months, the renovation work on the house properly caught up and finished out. The nasty old floors got replaced or refinished, new hardwood going in room by room over the course of several weeks, the workers apologizing more than once for the noise and disruption, while my roommate and I just tried to stay out of their way and let them work. The dirty, peeling wallpaper came down and got replaced with fresh paint throughout, the whole interior slowly brightening as each room got its turn, the transformation happening gradually enough that we almost didn't notice how dramatically the place had changed until we stood back one day and realized we could barely remember what the original wallpaper had even looked like anymore. The last of the old, heavy furniture, including that bed in my room that I'd become increasingly certain had been the exact spot where that elderly woman had spent her final moments, finally got hauled out and replaced with something new. A lighter, more modern frame that felt like mine in a way the old one never quite had, no matter how many nights I'd already spent sleeping in it by that point. By the time all of that work was finished, the house had become genuinely beautiful, completely unrecognizable compared to the run-down, grimy place we'd first walked through all those months earlier, the kind of transformation that made visitors who hadn't seen the before photos genuinely struggle to believe it was the same building. And somewhere in the middle of that transformation, all the weird occurrences that had been happening throughout that first month or so simply stopped. No more phantom footsteps on the porch at night. No more unlocked doors I was certain I'd secured. No more hearing each other awake and moving around the house when we were actually both still fast asleep in our own beds. The overall mood of the place shifted too, in a way that's hard to fully explain, but was noticeable to both of us. Something heavy and watchful in the atmosphere of those early months lifting and giving way to something that finally just felt like an ordinary, comfortable home. The kind of place you could walk through at midnight without that prickling sense of being observed from somewhere just out of sight. It was as if the entire renovation, beyond just fixing the physical state of the house, had somehow also settled whatever unrest had been lingering there since that woman's death, as though the neglect and mistreatment she'd apparently suffered in her final years had left something behind that only fully eased once the house itself was finally properly cared for again. Once someone had finally come along and given the place the attention it, and by extension maybe she herself, had been denied for that last difficult decade of her life. I like to believe, and I've held on to this interpretation ever since, that whatever was watching us that first month, whatever presence had been close enough that first night to leave me feeling watched, sweaty and itchy and dreaming of an old woman drawing steadily closer across my bedroom floor, has since settled into something more peaceful now that the house has been restored to something worth caring for again. I like to think that instead of watching us with whatever unease or unrest had been lingering there, she now simply watches over us, having finally seen the home she spent almost her entire life in return to a state of care and attention that she herself was denied in those final difficult years under a caretaker who never should have been trusted with her well-being in the first place. It's a comforting way to make sense of everything that happened. And I've noticed I lean on that interpretation, especially on quiet evenings when the house is still, and I catch myself thinking back to that first restless night, needing some way to file the memory as something that ultimately resolved itself peacefully, rather than something that's simply gone dormant and could return. My roommate and I still live there now, in that same beautiful renovated house, years after everything I've described here first happened, and neither of us has experienced anything unsettling in a very long time, nothing that echoes those strange weeks after we first moved in. But we both still think about that first month sometimes, quietly, usually without needing to say much out loud about it, both of us carrying the same private certainty that for a little while we weren't quite as alone in that house as we might have otherwise assumed. Every so often, usually around the anniversary of when we first moved in, one of us will bring it up over dinner, almost as a kind of ritual acknowledgement, trading the same details back and forth, even though we both already know every part of the story by heart. And every time, we land on the same conclusion, that whatever she was, whatever she needed from us during those strange early weeks, she seems to have finally found it, and we're grateful, in our own strange way, to have been the ones there when she did. Let me first set the scene properly, because the house itself is a big part of why any of this feels as unsettling as it does. My wife's parents live in a massive brick house built sometime in the early 1800s, a genuinely old structure that has since been fully restored to something truly beautiful, the kind of house that draws admiring comments from anyone who sees it for the first time. All exposed brick and heavy wooden beams, and a sense of permanence that newer homes just don't have. It sits on a good stretch of land, tall and imposing in that particular way old brick houses from that era tend to be, built to last centuries rather than decades. And by any ordinary measure, it's the kind of place people dream about owning. The restoration work alone took years, and my in-laws poured a tremendous amount of care and money into bringing the place back from the state of disrepair it had fallen into before they bought it, refinishing original woodwork, carefully repointing brick that had started to crumble in places, updating the plumbing and electrical without stripping away any of the character that made the house special in the first place. Walking through it now, you'd never guess the amount of neglect it had suffered in the decades before they took it on. But underneath that beautiful restoration is a history that the house has never quite let go of, and one that my in-laws have been careful never to paper over or ignore, even as they've worked to make the place livable and comfortable for a modern family. Built into the structure, hidden behind nearly every wall, are what used to be called slave corridors, narrow hidden passages built directly into the architecture of the house, along with two dedicated staircases meant for the same purpose. One coming out near the kitchen, and the other near the master bedroom. These weren't built as some kind of curiosity or decoration. They were functional parts of how the house originally operated, designed specifically to keep enslaved people moving through the home unseen by the family and any guests, a physical structure built entirely around the practice of slavery that the house's original owners depended on. Walking through those narrow corridors yourself, even now, gives you an immediate, visceral sense of what they were built for. Low ceilings and cramped walls meant to keep a person moving quickly and unseen. Nothing about the design meant for comfort or dignity. There's also a room down in the basement that has a handle only on the outside, no way to open it from within, which by itself tells you something about its original purpose before you even learn anything else about it. Inside that room is what used to be the coal room, the space that once served as the main source of heat for the entire house back before modern heating systems existed. Set into the walls of that same room are eye hooks, iron fixtures still bolted into the brick after all these years, which, from what we understand, were used to chain enslaved people who were forced to sleep in that space. Their beds apparently hung from those same hooks. It's a brutal, deeply upsetting piece of the house's history, one that my in-laws take seriously and have never tried to hide or downplay, even while they've worked to preserve and restore the rest of the structure, and one that weighs on all of us every time we're reminded of exactly what that space was used for. The last odd area worth mentioning is the attic, which has its own strange quality entirely, apart from the historical weight of the rest of the house. It has this tendency to feel almost impossible to consistently find your way to, in a way that always makes me think of that room in the Harry Potter books, the one that seems to appear only when someone specifically needs it and otherwise stays hidden from anyone looking for it. I know that sounds like an exaggeration, but more than once, different family members have described losing track of exactly where the attic entrance was within the house, despite having lived there for years, only to eventually find it again in the same spot it's always been, tucked behind a door that somehow manages to blend in more than any of the other doors in the house. Now, here are the actual happenings, the specific oddities we've experienced over the years, some of which I've been able to explain and debunk myself, and some of which I genuinely haven't found a satisfying explanation for, no matter how hard I've tried. The animals in that house, every single one of them, including the family cat, avoid the old slave areas completely, without exception. Every single time. A consistency that's honestly more unsettling than almost anything else in this whole story once you really sit with it. We stayed at the house for a weekend once, and I brought our dog along with us. A normally confident, easygoing animal who doesn't spook at much of anything under ordinary circumstances. The kind of dog who barely reacts to thunderstorms or fireworks and generally approaches new spaces with more curiosity than caution. I decided to take him outside using the staircase that comes out near the kitchen, the same one that had originally served as one of the hidden passages built into the house. The moment the entrance to that staircase became visible to him, he absolutely lost it, scrambling in the opposite direction as fast as his legs could carry him. The floors throughout that section of the house are all original hardwood, and his paws were slipping and sliding out from under him in his panic to get away. Claws scrabbling against the wood in a way I'd genuinely never seen from him before. An expression on his face that I can only describe as genuine terror. Nothing like his usual reactions to loud noises or strangers at the door. He didn't just hesitate or whine the way a nervous dog sometimes does around something new. He bolted, full sprint, ears pinned back, tail tucked so tight against his body it practically disappeared, and it took several minutes of coaxing in a completely different part of the house before he calmed down enough to even approach me again. This wasn't a one-time fluke either. He did the exact same thing every single time we approached either of the two slave staircases over that entire weekend, and the same reaction happened again in front of the basement door that leads down toward that old coal room, the panic identical each time, regardless of which of the three spots we approached. The same wild scramble, the same pinned ears, the same desperate need to put as much distance as possible between himself and that particular stretch of wall or floor. Nothing we tried could get him to willingly approach any of those three specific points in the house. No amount of coaxing or treats or familiar commands he'd normally respond to without hesitation. No gentle encouragement or slow, patient introduction to the space. We eventually gave up trying entirely and just avoided those parts of the house with him for the rest of the visit, both because it clearly wasn't working and because watching him react that way honestly started to unsettle the rest of us too. The intensity of his fear, feeling like it was telling us something we didn't fully want to know. The next oddity happened back when my in-laws first started remodeling the interior of the house, not long after they'd initially moved in. During that early period, they had two kittens, small and playful, still young enough that they got into everything, the way kittens do. They started noticing something deeply strange happening on an almost daily basis. They would come home from wherever they'd been during the day and find both kittens sealed inside clay pots, with the lids placed on top, locked inside the pantry that's tucked underneath one of the staircases. This wasn't a one-off occurrence they could write off as some strange accident. It happened nearly every single day for the better part of an entire year after they first moved into the house, the same specific scenario playing out again and again. Two kittens somehow ending up sealed inside clay pots with lids on, inside a locked pantry, every time they returned home. Neither of my in-laws has ever come up with an explanation for how kittens could physically manage any part of that sequence on their own, let alone repeat the exact same specific configuration day after day for months on end. Kittens don't lock doors behind themselves. They don't climb into clay pots and then somehow place lids on top of themselves from the inside. Every explanation my father-in-law tried to come up with in those early months fell apart the moment he actually thought it through, and eventually he simply stopped trying to explain it and just accepted it as one more strange fact about the house they now called home. For a long stretch of time, the family genuinely believed there was some kind of spirit or presence living up in that attic, given how strange the space already felt and how difficult it sometimes seemed to reliably find, along with occasional scratching and shuffling sounds that would carry down through the ceiling late at night. Eventually, though, I decided to try a more practical approach to that particular mystery, since I've always been the type to look for a rational explanation before assuming something supernatural is at play. I set up a live trap up there myself, baited it, and checked it regularly over the following weeks, and I ended up catching several raccoons that had apparently been living in the attic space, one after another. Clearly a whole family of them that had made themselves comfortable up there undisturbed for who knows how long. That discovery went a long way toward explaining at least some of the strange sounds and disturbances the family had been attributing to something more supernatural. And I felt genuinely satisfied solving that particular piece of the puzzle. Proof that not everything strange happening in that house needed some elaborate paranormal explanation. That sometimes the mundane answer really was the correct one, even in a house with as much history and strangeness as this one clearly had. But the one thing that has ever truly and completely creeped me out happened fairly recently, and it's the piece of this whole story I still haven't found any way to fully explain away, no matter how many times I've turned it over trying to find some rational thread to pull. My mother-in-law had found a set of genuine, true silver candlestick holders somewhere in the house back when they first moved in. Valuable antique pieces that had presumably belonged to the house's original occupants and been left behind over the generations, tucked away in some forgotten cabinet during the initial clean-out. Over time, she'd also bought some high-quality replicas, nearly indistinguishable from the originals unless you knew exactly what to look for and had them side by side to compare, and had placed both the real set and the replicas in various spots around the house as decoration. On the mantel, on the dining room sideboard, on a small table in the front hallway. One day, seemingly out of nowhere, every single silver holder in the house vanished at once. Both the genuine antiques and the replicas, along with her own mother's wedding ring set. A piece of jewelry with obvious, deep, sentimental value that had nothing to do with the house's original furnishings at all, and had only ever been kept in a jewelry box in the master bedroom. Our first assumption, the only one that seemed to make any practical sense at the time, was that some family member must have broken in and taken them. since none of the house's actually expensive electronics or other easily resold valuables had been touched at all. No televisions missing, no laptops gone. Nothing that would suggest an ordinary opportunistic thief looking for the fastest way to make money, which seemed like strange behavior for a burglar who presumably would have grabbed whatever was quickest and most valuable rather than specifically targeting silverware and a ring while walking right past far more sellable items. A couple of days after that discovery, the furnace down in the basement went out, and being the dutiful son-in-law that I try to be, I went down to help my father-in-law get it working again, both of us bundled up against the chill that had already started settling into the house without any heat running. While we were down there working through the basement toward the furnace, we walked past that same old coal room, the one with the handle only on the outside. And both of us caught a flicker of light glinting off something back in the far corner of that room, visible even through the narrow gap under the door. A small, bright glint that shouldn't have had any obvious source, given how dark that space normally stays. Her dad and I looked at each other, both curious, and went in to see what exactly was catching the light like that. Neither of us thinking much of it at first, beyond simple curiosity about what could possibly be reflecting light in a room that never had any light source of its own. We walked into the room to see what was shining, and it turned out to be her missing silver candlestick holders and her mother's wedding ring set. Sitting there in the corner of that same room with the eye hook still bolted into its walls, the room nobody in that house had any real reason to be storing valuables inside, especially not a room that could only be locked from the outside. Both of us got this genuinely sick, unsettling feeling standing there looking at it, the kind of cold dread that settles into your stomach before your rational mind has fully caught up to what you're looking at. Neither of us saying a word for a long moment as we both just stared at those items sitting there in the dust and old coal residue. We didn't linger. We just grabbed the items as quickly as we could and headed straight back upstairs. Neither of us saying much of anything to each other on the way, both a little shaken by what we just found in a room that had been locked the entire time, with nobody having any reasonable way to get in and leave those specific items sitting there. We brought everything up and showed it to her mom, explaining exactly where we'd found it, and her reaction was not at all what I'd expected. She didn't seem shocked, or even particularly surprised. She just took the items from us and put them right back where they'd originally been sitting around the house, and said in a firm, loud voice that left no room for argument that if the items got taken again, they could just stay down there this time. That she was only ever borrowing those things from the house in the first place, and understood that. But she made it clear, in that same firm tone, that whatever was taking things absolutely could not have her mother's wedding set. That particular item was not up for negotiation under any circumstances. She hasn't mentioned any of it since that day, hasn't brought it up again in conversation, even when the rest of us have occasionally circled back around to talking about it among ourselves. I went back down to that same room myself sometime after all of this happened, wanting to investigate more thoroughly on my own, because my first instinct was to look for a rational explanation the same way I had with the raccoons in the attic. I genuinely thought maybe raccoons or some other animal had somehow managed to drag those items down there themselves. Some strange combination of curiosity and bad luck that happened to result in shiny objects ending up in a locked room. I brought a flashlight down with me and spent a good half hour going over every inch of that space, checking the walls, the corners, even running my hand carefully along those old eye hooks, still bolted into the brick, trying to imagine any plausible sequence of events that could account for what we'd found. But when I actually got down there and searched the space carefully, I didn't find any animal tracks at all. No paw prints in the thick layer of coal dust that still covers most of that floor. Nothing that would suggest a raccoon or any other creature had been dragging objects across that space recently. The only marks I found anywhere in that dust were long, winding trails that looked exactly like something a snake would leave behind moving across a dusty surface. Thin, sinuous lines crossing the floor in a few different directions. Nothing that could account for how silver candlestick holders and a wedding ring set ended up sitting in the corner of a room that locks only from the outside. A room that nobody in that house had any reason or ability to access in the days those items went missing. I mentioned what I'd found to my wife later that evening, half expecting her to laugh it off or offer some explanation I hadn't thought of, but she just went quiet for a moment, the way people in that family tend to when the conversation edges too close to things they've collectively decided not to examine too closely. She told me, almost offhand, that this wasn't the first time something like this had happened in that house. That her parents had mentioned smaller versions of the same pattern over the years, small items going missing and turning up again somewhere unexpected, usually somewhere in that same general part of the basement, though nothing quite as significant or unsettling as the silver and the ring. It was the first time I'd heard any of that, and it left me with the distinct impression that my in-laws had simply learned, over years of living in that house, which questions were worth asking out loud and which ones were better left alone. I still don't have a real explanation for any of it, and honestly, given everything I already know about that house's history, I've mostly stopped actively looking for one. The dog still refuses to go anywhere near those staircases or that basement door every single time we visit, no exceptions. No matter how much time has passed since that first weekend, I tried to walk him through the kitchen entrance. The reaction just as intense years later as it was that very first time. The cat does the same, giving those same specific areas of the house a wide berth that never seems to lessen no matter how many uneventful years pass. Always choosing a longer path through the house rather than crossing anywhere near those three specific points. And every time I think back to standing in that cold room with my father-in-law, looking at those missing valuables sitting in the corner of a locked room with nothing but old snake trails in the dust around them, I get that same cold feeling settle back into my stomach all over again. The same one that hit me the first time, undiminished by however much time has passed since. My mother-in-law's response to the whole thing has stuck with me more than almost anything else about this entire story, honestly. The way she just accepted it. Matter of fact, drew her one firm boundary about her own mother's ring, and then simply moved on without another word about it, like she'd made some kind of arrangement or understanding with whatever it is that lives in that house. An agreement she wasn't particularly interested in discussing further with the rest of us. I've watched her since then, in the months and years following that whole incident, and she genuinely does seem to have settled into some kind of peace with it, going about her days in that house without any of the visible anxiety I might have expected from someone who just found her missing valuables sitting in a locked, historically horrific room in her own basement. She dusts those candlestick holders, same as always, moves them from the mantel to the dining table and back, depending on the season, the way she always has. She wears her mother's ring, same as she always has, never once mentioning it or treating it any differently than before. If anything unsettles her about what happened, she's never let it show, at least not to any of us, keeping whatever private understanding she's reached entirely to herself. I've never asked her directly what she really thinks is happening down there, partly out of respect for however she's chosen to process it, and partly, if I'm being honest, because some part of me isn't sure I actually want to hear her answer. My father-in-law, for his part, has become noticeably more careful about avoiding that basement alone since that day, always finding some excuse to bring one of us along whenever something down there needs attention. A habit I've noticed, but never directly commented on. understanding completely why he'd rather not go down there by himself anymore. Some houses, I've come to believe, hold on to more than just their history in the walls and the floorboards. Some of them seem to hold on to something that's still very much active, still very much present, still keeping whatever strange, unexplainable arrangement it's worked out with the people who live there now, borrowing things and returning them according to rules none of us fully understand, except apparently for the one clear line my mother-in-law drew and has never had crossed since. Whatever history that house carries in its walls, whatever remains of the people who suffered within them, seems to have settled into some kind of ongoing presence that hasn't fully left. One that the family has learned, in its own strange way, to live alongside rather than fully understand. We still visit that house regularly. Holidays and birthdays and ordinary weekend trips the same as any family does, and life there mostly carries on the way it would in any other beautiful old home. Nobody talks about the coal room much anymore, or the kittens in the clay pots, or the dog's reaction to those stairwells, unless a new guest happens to notice and ask about it. And even then, the explanations tend to come out matter of fact, almost rehearsed by now, the way a family settles in to telling the same story after enough years of it being simply part of how things are. But I notice things anyway, small habits nobody comments on directly. Nobody goes down to that basement alone after dark if they can help it. The kitchen staircase door stays shut even though nobody uses it for its original purpose anymore. And every single time I'm in that house, whether I'm thinking about it consciously or not, some part of me stays aware of exactly where those 3 points are, the 2 staircases and that basement door. The same 3 spots our dog has never once willingly approached in all the years since that first weekend. As though some part of me has learned the same lesson he learned that day, even without ever being able to explain exactly what that lesson actually is. I used to live at a hotel in Norway for a stretch of about 3.5 years, which probably sounds like an unusual living arrangement to most people, but it made sense for the kind of work I was doing at the time, and the hotel itself became something close to a real home over that period. Long-term stays like that aren't entirely unheard of, especially for certain kinds of work assignments. And the hotel had accommodated a handful of other long-term guests before me, though I ended up being one of the longer tenures anyone on staff could remember. I got to know the staff well over those years, learned the rhythms of the place, the quiet hours and the busy ones, the sound the elevator made when it stopped on each floor, the way the breakfast room filled up and emptied out on a predictable schedule every morning. All the small details that come from actually living somewhere rather than just passing through as an ordinary guest for a night or two. By the end of my time there, I probably knew that building better than some of the newer staff members did, having wandered its hallways and stairwells more times than I could count over those 3.5 years, familiar with every creak in the floorboards and every quirk of the old elevator that took just slightly too long to arrive on the upper floors. Now, I think almost every hotel of any real age ends up with some kind of ghost story attached to it eventually, whether there's anything to it or not. Staff talk, guests talk, stories get passed around and exaggerated a little more with each retelling until every hotel with enough history behind it has at least one room or one hallway that people whisper about, usually in a lighthearted way over drinks after a shift, rather than anything treated with real seriousness. The kind of story that gets pulled out mostly to entertain new hires or curious guests rather than anything the staff genuinely lose sleep over themselves. This particular hotel was no exception to that pattern, though I didn't actually know that when I first moved in. Nobody warned me about any of the supposedly spooky stuff associated with the place, not when I checked in. Not during those first few days of settling into my new long-term arrangement. Not even in the casual small talk that usually happens between new long-term guests and the staff who will be seeing them regularly for months or years to come. I found out about all of it much later, and in a far stranger way than I ever would have expected. Through an experience that ended up confirming the story rather than just hearing it secondhand the way most guests probably did, if they ever heard it at all. I ended up staying in a room on the 5th floor for that first stretch of my time there. An ordinary enough room by any measure. Nothing about it that struck me as unusual or particularly notable when I first moved my things in. It had the standard layout you'd expect from a hotel room of that era. A small bathroom tucked just off the entryway. A main room with a bed and a desk and the usual furnishings. A window looking out over the street below. Nothing that gave any hint of the reputation I'd eventually learn it carried. I remember unpacking my things that first day. Arranging the room the way you do when you know you'll be staying somewhere for a while rather than just passing through. Setting up a small workspace at the desk. Finding a spot for the few personal items I'd brought with me. Hanging a couple of pictures I'd carried along specifically to make the space feel less transient. Treating it more like the start of a new home than a temporary hotel stay. Which in a sense it was. During the daytime, fairly early on in my stay there, I started noticing something odd. I could hear what sounded unmistakably like a child crying, and the sound seemed to be coming from the direction of my bathroom. At first, this didn't strike me as particularly alarming or strange. Hotels, especially older ones with plumbing systems that have been added onto and modified over decades of renovations, often have pipes that run between floors and rooms in ways that carry sound much further and much more clearly than you'd expect. I figured what I was hearing was simply sound traveling through jointed piping somewhere in the building's infrastructure, probably originating from another room on a different floor entirely. Maybe a family staying somewhere below or above me with a child going through a rough patch. The sound finding its way to my bathroom through whatever shared plumbing connected our rooms. It wasn't a loud or overwhelming sound, just present enough to notice while I was moving around the room, a faint, muffled crying that seemed to ebb and flow the way a genuinely upset child's crying often does. It was an easy explanation, and one that made complete logical sense given everything I knew about how old buildings tend to carry sound in unexpected ways. Having lived in a few older buildings myself over the years, and grown used to the particular acoustic quirks that come with plumbing and ductwork that's been modified and patched together across multiple generations of renovation. I didn't think much more about it in that moment. I went about the rest of my day without giving the crying any further thought. Filing it away as one of those minor quirks you learn to live with when you're staying somewhere with older infrastructure. The kind of thing you mention to a friend in passing, if you mention it at all, more as a mildly interesting observation than anything worth dwelling on. The sort of small detail that fades into the background noise of daily life within a building you're settling into. That night, though, is when things started to feel a little different. A little harder to explain away with the same easy logic I'd applied during the day. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night, the way you sometimes do without any particular reason. No alarm, no external noise that I could immediately identify as having pulled me out of sleep. As I lay there in the dark, still half caught in that groggy transition between sleep and full wakefulness, I became aware that I could still hear the child crying. Not a fading memory of the sound from earlier in the day, but an active, present sound happening right at that moment, distinct and clear, and unmistakably coming from the direction of my bathroom, the same as it had during the daylight hours. The room around me was completely silent otherwise. No traffic noise from the street outside, no sounds from the hallway, nothing but that same faint, persistent crying carrying through the darkness from behind the closed bathroom door. What struck me most, lying there in the dark, listening to it, was that it was the exact same voice I'd heard earlier, with the exact same intensity and quality to the crying. It wasn't just similar in a general sense, the way two different children crying might sound broadly alike. It was identical, down to specific qualities in the pitch and rhythm of the sound that I found myself somehow recognizing from earlier that same day, as if I were hearing a recording played back rather than encountering the sound fresh. The same rise and fall, the same particular catch in the breath between sobs that I hadn't consciously noted as distinctive earlier, but somehow, immediately, recognized now. I lay there for a while just listening to it, propped up slightly on one elbow, trying to decide whether I was fully awake or still caught somewhere in a lingering dream, running through the same logical explanation I'd settled on earlier about jointed pipes and sound traveling between rooms, trying to convince myself that this was simply a continuation of the exact same mundane phenomenon, just happening to occur again at this particular hour, some family's child having a rough night that happened to line up with my own waking. Eventually, the crying faded, or I drifted back into sleep, or some combination of both, and I didn't think much more about it until the following morning, when I mentioned it to one of the front desk clerks almost as a passing comment, more out of curiosity than actual concern. I remember walking down to the lobby that morning, still turning the previous night over a little in my mind, not troubled by it exactly, but curious enough that I wanted to mention it, half expecting a quick, simple explanation that would let me stop thinking about it altogether. I told her that the child staying in the room beneath mine had kept me up during the night, explaining that I could hear the crying coming through what I assumed was jointed piping somewhere in the building connecting our rooms together. I wasn't upset about it or filing any kind of formal complaint, just making conversation, mentioning it the way you'd mention any minor inconvenience of shared living in an old building, expecting maybe a sympathetic nod or a brief apology on behalf of the hotel before we both moved on to whatever else needed discussing that morning. Maybe even a small joke about how thin the walls could be in older buildings like this one. Her response was not at all what I expected, and it unfolded in a sequence that has stuck with me clearly ever since, each part landing with a little more weight than the one before it, her expression shifting subtly with each thing she told me, moving from polite attentiveness to something closer to careful hesitation as she worked her way through what she needed to say. First, she told me that there had been no children staying anywhere in the hotel that particular night. Not in the room beneath mine, not anywhere else on any floor. She said this with a certainty that made it clear she wasn't simply guessing or assuming, that she actually knew the guest registry for that night, and could say with confidence that no families with young children had been checked in anywhere in the building, glancing briefly toward the computer screen at the desk as if to double-check her own memory even as she said it. I remember pausing at that, already starting to feel a little unsettled, but still holding on to my original explanation, thinking maybe the crying had come from further away than I'd assumed, maybe traveling through more of the building's plumbing system than I'd initially accounted for, reaching my bathroom from some room much further from mine than directly below, some more distant part of the building's shared infrastructure that I hadn't properly considered. That's when she told me the second thing, which undercut that remaining explanation almost entirely. She said that the pipes in that particular section of the building were not, in fact, jointed in the way I'd assumed, that the plumbing serving my room and the surrounding rooms didn't actually connect in a way that would allow sound to travel between them the way I described, that the renovation work done in recent years had actually separated much of that shared piping specifically, to cut, down on exactly the kind of noise transfer between rooms that I'd assumed was happening. Whatever architectural assumption I'd been leaning on to explain away that crying sound simply didn't hold up. According to someone who presumably knew the building's actual infrastructure far better than I did as a guest, however long-term my stay happened to be. And then came the third thing, delivered almost matter-of-factly, without any particular dramatic emphasis, which somehow made it land even harder than if she'd said it with more weight behind it. She told me that the room I'd been staying in that night was the hotel's designated haunted room, the specific room that carried whatever reputation and history had built up around the property over the years. The one room that came up whenever staff or longtime guests talked about these strange stories associated with the place, mentioning it almost apologetically. Like she wished someone had thought to warn me sooner, but hadn't wanted to make a big deal out of something most of the staff themselves treated as more of an odd curiosity than a serious concern. I sat with that information for a long moment, turning over everything I'd just heard against everything I thought I'd already logically explained the night before, standing there at the front desk while she waited, patient and a little apologetic, for whatever reaction I might have. Every rational piece of the puzzle I'd assembled for myself, the idea of jointed pipes, the idea of a child staying somewhere nearby, both of those had just been directly contradicted by someone with far more actual knowledge of the building and its current occupancy than I had. Someone whose job it literally was to know exactly who was staying where on any given night. And what was left, once those explanations had been taken away, was simply the fact that I had heard a child crying, twice, once during the day and once distinctly in the middle of the night, coming specifically from my bathroom, in a room with no children anywhere near it, and no plumbing connection that could account for sound traveling in from elsewhere. An experience that no longer had any convenient, mundane explanation left standing to lean on. I want to be clear that I didn't have some dramatic reaction to learning all of this. I wasn't overcome with terror or anything close to it. Didn't feel my pulse spike the way you might expect from someone realizing they'd spent the night in a supposedly haunted room. If anything, my reaction was closer to a kind of bemused curiosity, a sense of finding the whole situation more interesting and even a little funny than genuinely frightening, and I remember actually laughing a little right there at the desk, more out of surprise than anything else, which seemed to visibly put the clerk a bit more at ease, like she'd been bracing herself for a more upset reaction from me. Maybe that's just my personality, or maybe it's because the actual experience of hearing the crying itself, in the moment, had never felt threatening or malicious in any way. It was just crying, ordinary sounding, nothing menacing about the tone or the pattern of it, nothing that made me feel unsafe or like I needed to be afraid in the room itself, no sense of a presence in the room with me, no cold spots or strange smells or any of the more dramatic hallmarks people usually associate with a genuinely frightening haunting. Just a sound, out of place and unexplained, but never once threatening in how it actually felt to experience. Over the remaining years I stayed at that hotel, I never heard that particular crying again. Not in that room, and not anywhere else in the building. Despite eventually moving between a few different rooms over the course of my long stay there for various reasons unrelated to any of this, mostly just routine reshuffling that happens with long-term guests as the hotel manages its regular bookings and availability. I did, however, end up hearing more about the hotel's history from various staff members over time, small pieces of stories shared casually during quiet moments at the front desk or in the staff areas I sometimes found myself in, given how long I'd been living there and how familiar I'd become with the day-to-day operations of the place. Having built up enough rapport with the regular staff over those years that conversations naturally drifted into more personal territory than a typical guest would ever get to experience. Nobody ever gave me a full, coherent account of exactly what had supposedly happened in that room to earn it the reputation it apparently carried. Whether there was some specific incident from the hotel's earlier history involving a child that people connected to the crying, or whether the story had simply built up over years of guests reporting similar experiences without any specific origin story attached to it at all, layered together over enough time that nobody currently working there could point to a clear starting point anymore. A couple of the older staff members, the ones who'd worked there the longest, hinted at something from decades earlier, some vague reference to an incident involving a family staying in that room long before any of the current staff had started working there, but nobody seemed to actually know the full details themselves. Each version I heard slightly different from the last, contradicting small points here and there in the way stories tend to when they've been passed down through enough retellings without anyone ever writing the original account down properly. I never pushed too hard for more details, partly because the staff themselves always seemed a little reluctant to go too deep into it, offering fragments and hints rather than any complete narrative. The way people often do with stories they've inherited secondhand, rather than experienced directly themselves. And partly because I found I didn't actually need a full explanation to feel satisfied with the experience I'd had. A few other long-term guests I got to know over those years asked me about it eventually too, word having apparently spread a little among the small community of people who, like me, ended up staying at that hotel for extended periods rather than just a night or two. A loose network of familiar faces who greeted each other in the breakfast room and occasionally traded stories over coffee about. Life as semi-permanent residents of a place most people only ever visited briefly. I told the story pretty much the same way each time. The daytime crying, the identical crying at night, and then the clerk's three-part explanation the next morning. And I noticed people's reactions tended to fall into two camps fairly evenly split. Some treating it with genuine unease, glancing instinctively toward the ceiling or the walls as if checking for something, and others treating it much the way I did myself, with amused curiosity rather than any real fear. More interested in the strange, logical structure of the story than actually frightened by it. What I keep coming back to whenever I think about that whole experience now, years removed from actually living in that hotel, is how ordinary the whole thing felt in the moment, despite how strange it looks laid out afterward. I wasn't someone who went looking for a ghost story. I wasn't primed to expect anything unusual, hadn't heard any warnings or rumors before that night that might have shaped what I heard or how I interpreted it. I simply heard a sound, applied the most logical explanation available to me at the time, and only learned afterward, entirely by accident, through a completely mundane conversation with a front desk clerk, that the logical explanation I'd settled on didn't actually hold up against the facts of the building and its occupancy that night. I don't think of this as a particularly frightening story, and I've told it to a fair number of people over the years since it happened, usually more for its amusement value than for any real scare it provides. There's something almost comic about the structure of it. The way each piece of information the clerk gave me knocked out my previous explanation one at a time. No children in the building, no jointed pipes, and finally, almost as a punchline, the reveal that I'd unknowingly spent the night in the one room in the entire hotel that already had a reputation for exactly this kind of thing. It's the kind of story that gets a laugh at a dinner table more often than it gets a shiver, and I think that's exactly the right reaction to have to it. A story better suited to being told with a grin over drinks than in hushed tones meant to unsettle anyone listening. I've noticed over the years that the people who enjoy the story most tend to be the ones who appreciate a good structural joke as much as an actual scare. People who like the shape of the reveal more than they need to be genuinely frightened by the content of it. I've also noticed that retelling it enough times has smoothed the edges of it a little, the way any story does with repetition, though I've always tried to stay honest to exactly what happened rather than embellishing it the way ghost stories so often get exaggerated over time. I don't add extra details I didn't actually experience. I don't claim the crying got louder or more distressed the second time, or that I felt some kind of cold presence in the room, because none of that actually happened. What I experienced was simple and specific. A crying sound heard twice, an easy explanation offered and then systematically dismantled by someone who had every reason to know better than I did. That simplicity is part of what I like about the story, honestly. The fact that it doesn't need embellishment to be interesting. That the plain facts of it are strange enough on their own without needing any dramatic flourishes added on top. Still, even now, so many years after I finally moved on from that hotel and that particular chapter of my life, I find myself thinking about it every so often, usually at unexpected moments. The sound of running water somewhere reminding me of it, or someone else telling their own hotel ghost story, prompting me to share mine in return, always getting some version of the same reaction. A mix of amusement and mild unease that seems to land differently depending on who's listening. I never went looking for an explanation beyond what the clerk told me that morning, never dug into old newspaper archives or tried to track down some tragic historical incident that might account for a crying child supposedly tied to that specific room, even though the curious part of me has occasionally wondered whether such records might even exist somewhere, filed away in the hotel's own paperwork or in some local historical archive I've never had reason to search through. Part of me has always preferred leaving it exactly as it happened, an odd little unexplained fragment from those years I spent living in that hotel. Interesting enough to tell and retell, but never quite unsettling enough to actually keep me up at night the way the story might for someone else hearing it secondhand. I suppose that's the strange gift of having lived through something like that directly, rather than only hearing about it from someone else. The mystery stays exactly as mysterious as it originally was, without ever curdling into genuine fear. Just a small, persistent, amusing question mark that I've carried with me ever since. One I've mostly made peace with never actually answering. Every now and then, when I tell the story to someone new, I catch myself smiling a little at the memory of that clerk's expression as she worked through those three explanations. No children, no jointed pipes, and finally the reveal about the room itself, each one landing a little harder than the last, turning what started as an ordinary morning complaint into the strangest and most memorable conversation I ever had at that front desk during my entire 3.5 years living there. This happened way back in 2002, during my undergrad years, in a co-ed dorm at the college I attended. I still think about it more than 20 years later, which tells you something about how deeply it settled into my memory. Because most things from that time in my life have faded into a general blur of exams, late nights, and the kind of forgettable routine that fills up a college semester. This one night never faded. If anything, it got sharper the more time passed, the details more fixed in my mind, like my brain refused to let this particular memory soften the way memories usually do. It was the night before one of our final exams, which meant the whole dorm was in that particular kind of chaos that only exists in the 24 hours before a big test. Doors were propped open up and down the hallways, people wandering between rooms, borrowing notes, arguing over practice questions, complaining about how little they'd studied and how much was left to cover. Coffee and energy drink cans were piling up in the common areas faster than anyone could throw them away. It was loud and stressful and strangely comforting all at once, the way shared misery tends to be when you're young and surrounded by people going through the exact same thing you are. The dorm building itself was an old one, the kind that had probably been standing on campus for decades before either of us was born, with narrow hallways, thin walls that let every sound bleed through from one room to the next, and radiators that clanked and hissed at odd hours no matter what season it was. It wasn't the kind of building anyone would call creepy under normal circumstances. It was just old and a little worn down the way most college dorms tend to be after years of students moving in and out. But there was always a certain hush that settled over it in the deep hours of the night, after the common areas emptied out, and even the most dedicated last-minute studiers finally gave up and went to bed. I was studying that night in my girlfriend's room. We'd been together for a while by that point. Long enough that spending late nights studying together in one of our rooms had become a normal part of our routine, especially during exam season. Her room was quieter than mine, tucked away from the main stretch of the hallway where most of the noise and traffic happened, and she had a small desk lamp that gave off just enough light to read by without making the whole room feel too bright and awake at 2 in the morning. We'd been going over our notes for hours, quizzing each other, taking short breaks to complain about how impossible the exam was going to be, the usual routine. Around 2 in the morning, she finally hit her limit. She'd been rubbing her eyes for the last half hour, her answers getting slower and less coherent, the way anyone's do when their brain has simply stopped absorbing new information, no matter how many times they reread the same paragraph. She told me she needed to sleep, that she couldn't cram anything else into her head that night, and she climbed into her bed, pulled the blanket over herself, and was out within what felt like minutes. I stayed up, because I still had a decent chunk of material left to cover, and I wasn't ready to give up on the night yet, not with an exam looming just a few hours away. The two of us had a good rhythm for studying together, one that had developed naturally over the months we'd been together. She liked working through problems out loud, talking her way to an answer, while I preferred silence and my own notes, so we'd settled into an arrangement where she'd quiz me on facts, and I'd help her think through the more complicated problems, trading off whenever one of us hit a wall. That night had followed the same pattern as every other exam night before it. Nothing unusual about it at all up until the point she finally gave up and climbed into bed. I kept at it for another 2 hours, sitting at her desk with the lamp angled just enough to keep the light off her face while she slept, flipping through pages, rewriting summaries, doing all the last-minute panic studying that never actually helps as much as you hope it will, but that you do anyway. Because the alternative, doing nothing, feels even worse. By around 4 in the morning, I was finally done, or at least as done as I was going to get. My eyes were burning, my brain felt like it had been wrung out, like a wet towel, and I knew I needed to sleep if I wanted to have any functioning brain cells left for the exam later that morning. I remember stretching my arms above my head and feeling every joint in my back protest after hours hunched over a desk, that particular soreness that only comes from too many consecutive hours of studying in a bad posture. The problem was my own room. I lived 4 floors down from her, and my room was all the way at the end of a long hallway, the kind of walk that feels twice as long as it actually is when you're exhausted, and it's 4 in the morning and the whole building is dead silent, except for the occasional muffled snoring or the hum of a vending machine somewhere. I did not want to make that walk. Every part of my tired brain rebelled against the idea of leaving the warm, familiar room I was already in, just to trudge down 4 flights of stairs and through a long, dim hallway to my own bed. So I decided I'd just sleep there, in her room, on the floor. Her bed was completely out of the question for 2 people to share comfortably that night anyway. Not because of any awkwardness between us, but because it was absolutely covered in soft toys. She'd had a small collection of stuffed animals since she was a kid, and somewhere along the way that collection had migrated with her to college and taken over roughly half of her twin-sized dorm bed. There genuinely wasn't room for another person to squeeze in there without either kicking half the stuffed animals onto the floor or spending the whole night curled up in some uncomfortable position along the very edge of the mattress. I found a sleeping bag she kept folded up in the bottom of her closet. The kind of basic, slightly musty sleeping bag every college student seems to own but never actually uses for camping, and I laid it out on the floor of her room. I want to describe the setup carefully, because it matters for what happened next. Her bed was positioned so that when she lay down, she was facing the door of the room, the door that led out into the hallway. I set up the sleeping bag on the floor between her bed and the door, but positioned myself facing her, which meant I was lying with my back toward the door and my face turned toward her bed. From where I was lying, I had a clear, direct line of sight to her. No obstructions, nothing blocking my view, just the dim residual light from the hallway seeping in under the door and whatever pale light came through the window from outside. I settled into the sleeping bag, pulled it up around myself, and lay there for a moment just staring at the ceiling and then at her, my mind still buzzing faintly with everything I'd just studied. That particular kind of restless, wired exhaustion, where your body is desperate for sleep but your brain refuses to fully power down. I remember thinking about one specific section of the exam material, running through it one more time in my head, trying to cement it in before I let myself drift off. The room was quiet, in the particular way only a dorm room can be at 4 in the morning. That heavy, almost pressurized silence you only get once the entire building has finally gone still. Not even 5 minutes had passed since I'd lain down. I know it was close to 5 minutes because I remember glancing at the small clock on her desk before I settled onto the floor, and then again shortly after, that specific habit anxious students develop during exam season of constantly checking how much time is left, even when it's the middle of the night and there's nothing productive left to do. I was still fully awake, eyes open, staring at her sleeping form in the dim light, my mind still turning over exam material when it happened. She jerked upright. Not the slow, groggy way someone sits up when they're half asleep and shifting position. Not the startled, but soft way someone sits up after a bad dream. This was fast, sudden, mechanical almost, like something had physically yanked her upward by an invisible string. Her torso snapped into a perfect right angle with her legs, forming this stiff, unnatural L shape that her body simply should not have been able to move into that quickly, especially not straight from a dead sleep. Her arms shot outward to either side of her body, fully extended, parallel to the ground. And I hate to make this comparison because we weren't religious, neither of us was Christian, and it feels almost disrespectful to reach for that image, but it was the only comparison my brain could produce in that moment. She looked like a crucifix, sitting upright in that stiff right angle, arms spread wide and rigid on either side of her. Her whole body locked into this position that had no natural explanation for how a sleeping person's muscles could achieve it in a split second with no warning. And then she started speaking. Not mumbling, not the soft, garbled half-words people sometimes say in their sleep that dissolve into nothing before they form a full sentence. This was clear, deliberate-sounding speech, flowing at a steady rhythm like actual sentences, in a language I did not recognize at all. It wasn't English, and it wasn't her first language either, which I knew well because I'd heard her speak it plenty of times before, on the phone with her family, muttering under her breath when she was frustrated. Whatever came out of her mouth in that moment was something else entirely. Syllables and sounds strung together in a pattern I had never heard before and have never heard since. Delivered with a strange, even cadence, almost like a chant or a recitation, not the chaotic randomness you'd expect from meaningless sleep talk. I lay frozen on that floor, completely unable to move, staring up at her rigid, spread-armed silhouette against the faint light from the window, listening to this stream of unfamiliar words pour out of her in the dead quiet of 4 in the morning. It felt like it lasted much longer than it actually did, the way genuinely terrifying moments always seem to stretch time out far beyond what the clock would actually confirm afterward. In reality, it could not have been more than 5 seconds, maybe less. And then, just as suddenly as she had jerked upright, she dropped. Her whole body just collapsed backward onto the bed, flopping down into a normal sleeping position among her stuffed animals, and within moments her breathing had evened out into the slow, steady rhythm of deep sleep, as if absolutely nothing had happened at all. For a moment after she dropped back onto the bed, I genuinely questioned whether I had actually seen what I thought I had just seen. That's how disorienting it was, even in the immediate aftermath, sitting there in the dark with my heart hammering against my ribs. Part of my brain, the tired, rational, exam-stressed part, tried to talk me down, tried to suggest that maybe I had drifted off for a second without realizing it and dreamed the whole thing in some brief, vivid flash before jolting back awake. But I knew that wasn't true, even as I was trying to convince myself of it, because I could still feel the tension in my own body, the way my muscles had gone stiff and my breath had caught in my throat the moment she moved. You don't feel your own physical fear response like that from something you dreamed. My body knew, even before my mind fully caught up, that what had just happened was real, and that recognition is not something you can talk yourself out of after the fact, no matter how much you want to. I did not sleep for the rest of that night. I lay there on that thin sleeping bag on her floor, staring up at the ceiling, then back at her sleeping form, waiting, half expecting it to happen again, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Every small sound in the dorm, every creak of the old building settling, every distant footstep in the hallway outside made me flinch. I kept replaying what I'd just seen over and over in my head, trying to find some rational explanation for it. Some version of events where what I'd witnessed was just an unusually dramatic episode of ordinary sleep talking, a weird but explainable quirk of the sleeping brain. I couldn't land on anything that actually made sense. I've seen people talk in their sleep before, mumble, even sit up briefly in a confused, half-awake state. I had never seen anyone move like that, with that kind of mechanical speed and precision, into a position that specific, holding it for that exact amount of time, speaking words in a language she didn't know, before dropping instantly back into peaceful, undisturbed sleep. When morning came and she woke up for real, stretching and complaining about how little sleep she'd gotten before the exam, I told her what had happened. I described it exactly the way I just described it to you. The sudden jerk upright, the rigid right angle, the arms spread out to the sides, the unfamiliar language, the abrupt collapse back into sleep. She looked at me like I'd lost my mind. She had absolutely no memory of any of it, not even a vague sense that something strange had happened during the night, the way people sometimes have a fuzzy half-memory of a weird dream. Nothing, as far as her own experience was concerned. She had gone to sleep at 2 in the morning and woken up naturally around 7, with a completely uneventful night in between. She didn't believe me, not really, not for a long time. She thought I must have dreamed it myself, half asleep on that uncomfortable floor after a long night of studying, my exhausted brain conjuring up some vivid, unsettling image that felt real in the moment but was really just a hallucination born out of sleep deprivation. I understood why she thought that. If our positions had been reversed, if she'd been the one telling me this story instead of the one who lived through it, I probably would have said the same thing to her. It sounds impossible. It sounds like exactly the kind of thing an overtired, stressed-out mind produces at 4 in the morning after hours of cramming for an exam. But I know what I saw. I was not asleep. I was not dreaming. I remember the sequence of events too clearly, too specifically, with too many small, consistent details for it to have been some fragmented dream image that my exhausted brain filled in later. I remember exactly where the dim light was coming from, exactly how her silhouette looked against it, exactly how long the whole episode lasted, exactly what her arms looked like extended out to either side, rigid and unnaturally straight. Dreams don't usually hold together with that kind of consistent, specific detail, especially not ones you can recall clearly and identically more than 20 years later without the memory shifting or blurring the way dream memories tend to. We stayed together for a while after that, through the rest of that year and into the next, and I never saw anything like it happen again. Not once, not that night, not any other night we spent studying together or falling asleep in the same room over the following months. She never had any similar episode before that night either. At least none that she or her family had ever mentioned to me. No history of sleepwalking or night terrors or anything close to what I witnessed that morning. It was a single, isolated event. One moment out of the hundreds of nights we spent together, standing completely alone, with no pattern before it and no repetition after it. In the days right after it happened, I found myself doing a lot of quiet research whenever I had a spare moment between studying for the rest of our exams. I looked up sleep talking, sleep paralysis, night terrors, every medical term I could think of that might come close to describing what I'd seen. A lot of what I found described people mumbling incoherent phrases, sometimes full sentences, occasionally even sitting partway up in confusion before settling back down. None of it matched the specific mechanical suddenness of what I witnessed. That instant snap into a fully formed, rigid position, arms locked out to the sides with a precision that looked almost deliberate, like a pose rather than an accident of unconscious movement. Night terrors, from what I read, usually come with visible distress, a racing heart, sometimes screaming or crying, a body that looks like it's caught in the middle of fear. What I saw looked calm, controlled almost. There was no panic in her face, no visible fear. Just this eerie stillness, holding that unnatural shape, while unfamiliar words came out of her mouth in that same steady, even tone, like she was reciting something she had said 1,000 times before. I even brought it up carefully with her roommate a few weeks later, without going into too much detail, just asking in a roundabout way whether she'd ever noticed anything unusual about my girlfriend's sleep habits, whether she talked in her sleep often or moved around a lot at night. Her roommate said no, nothing like that she was actually one of the quietest, most still sleepers she'd ever shared a room with, barely shifting position through the night. No snoring, no talking, nothing. That answer stuck with me for a long time afterward, because it meant whatever happened that one specific night wasn't part of some ongoing pattern that everyone around her had simply gotten used to and stopped mentioning. It was singular, out of place. A single break in an otherwise unremarkable, quiet sleeping habit that had never produced anything like it before, and never would again, as far as anyone around her ever noticed. Eventually, we parted ways, the way a lot of college relationships do once you graduate and life pulls people in different directions, different cities, different jobs, different priorities that no longer line up the way they once did. We stayed in touch loosely for a while afterward, the occasional message around holidays, and once, years later, I brought up that night again, half expecting her to finally admit she remembered something about it, or that she'd talked to a doctor about it at some point and found some kind of explanation. She still had no memory of it at all. It remained, for her, A story I told her about herself, rather than something she had actually lived through. A gap in her own experience that she could never fill in no matter how many times I described it to her. She told me, half joking, half genuinely a little unsettled, that it was strange to think there was a 5-second window of her own life that existed only in someone else's memory. A moment she had technically lived through but could never actually access herself. Like a small locked room inside her own past that only I had the key to. I think about it sometimes, usually late at night when I can't sleep for whatever reason, my mind wandering back through old memories the way it does when the house is quiet and there's nothing else to focus on. I picture her sitting there in that stiff, unnatural position, arms spread wide in the dim light of that dorm room, speaking words in a language neither of us understood, and then collapsing back into peaceful sleep like a puppet whose strings had simply been let go all at once. I've never come up with an explanation that actually satisfies me. Not sleep paralysis, not night terrors, not any of the medical explanations I've read about over the years trying to make sense of what I witnessed. None of them quite fit the specific, deliberate quality of what happened. The sense that whatever was moving her body and shaping those unfamiliar words in that brief handful of seconds was not simply a glitch in her sleeping brain, but something else entirely. Something using her, just for a moment, before letting her go and slipping back into wherever it came from. Sometimes I try to imagine what those words might have meant, if they meant anything at all. I've thought about trying to record something like it if it ever happened again, playing it for a linguist or someone who studies old languages, just to see if it matched anything real. It never happened again, so that idea never went anywhere. But the thought experiment itself used to keep me up some nights early on, wondering whether what came out of her mouth that night was gibberish assembled by an exhausted, confused brain, or whether it was something with actual structure and meaning. A real sentence in a real language, spoken fluently and confidently by someone who had never studied it a day in her life. I'll never know the answer to that, and I think that unresolved uncertainty is part of why the memory has stayed so sharp all these years, refusing to soften into something easier to dismiss the way most old memories eventually do. I've told this story to a handful of people since then, close friends mostly, over the years. Usually late at night in the kind of settings where people start swapping their own unexplainable stories, everyone trying to one-up the last person's tale with something stranger and harder to believe. Every time I tell it, I watch the same reaction cross their faces, that mix of genuine unease and polite disbelief. The look of someone who wants to say it was probably nothing but can't quite bring themselves to say it out loud because something about the specific, quiet detail of the story makes it hard to dismiss outright. I don't blame them. I probably would have looked at someone the same way if they'd told me this story instead of it being something I lived through myself. But I was there. I was awake, lying just a few feet away, watching it happen in real time with my own eyes. And more than 20 years later, I still don't have anything close to a satisfying explanation for those 5 strange, silent seconds in the middle of the night, when the person I loved sat bolt upright, spoke in a voice and a language that wasn't hers, and then simply lay back down as if nothing at all had happened. When I was about 2 years old, my mother bought a Ouija board. She wasn't the type of person you'd expect to own something like that, not particularly superstitious, not into the occult in any serious way, just curious in that idle way people get sometimes, the way you might pick up a tarot deck at a flea market just to see what happens when you try it. She told me later that she'd bought it almost as a joke, something to mess around with on a slow evening, never expecting it to actually do anything. She said the first few times she sat down with it, nothing much happened. The planchette drifting around under her fingers in vague, meaningless patterns, the way you'd expect from an object that shouldn't really work at all. Then, according to her, that changed. She said she started making contact with something, a presence that identified itself clearly and consistently every time she sat down with the board, giving the same name over and over. Henry, an 8-year-old boy. She described the sessions to me later in a way that made it clear how quickly the novelty of the whole thing wore off and turned into something heavier. It wasn't a single strange evening she could easily write off as coincidence or an overactive imagination. It happened again and again, night after night, for a stretch of time. The planchette moving with a confidence and a purpose that felt completely different from the aimless drifting she'd experienced before Henry first came through. She said she could feel her own hands being guided in a way that didn't feel like her own muscles making the movement, like something else entirely was directing the small piece of wood under her fingertips. At first, she said, it felt almost sweet in a strange way, like talking to a lonely kid who wanted company. But that impression didn't last long. Henry, according to my mother, had a very specific message that he repeated across multiple sessions, in different words, but always circling back to the same core idea. He hated me. He told her, over and over, that I had stolen his place in the world, that I had taken something that was supposed to belong to him, and that my mother was supposed to be his mother, not mine. She told me that some sessions he would spell it out calmly, almost matter of fact, as though he was simply stating an obvious truth she should have already understood. Other times, she said, the planchette would move so fast and so forcefully across the board that she had trouble keeping her fingers on it at all, the anger behind the message seeming to intensify the longer the conversation went on, until she'd finally break contact out of pure fear and sit there, shaking in the quiet aftermath, unable to fully process what had just happened. I should explain something here that makes this story more than just a strange thing my mother said happened during a phase of dabbling with a board game. About a year after I was born, my mother had a miscarriage. She lost a child she was carrying, a pregnancy that never made it to term, and by all accounts it devastated her, in the quiet, private way these things tend to devastate parents. Something she carried with her for years afterward without talking about it much, the way people from her generation often didn't talk openly about loss like that. She never knew for certain if that lost child would have been a boy or a girl, and she told me once that not knowing made the grief harder in its own way, leaving her with no clear image to hold on to. Nothing but an absence shaped like a question she'd never get the chance to answer. There was no way for her to know back then, no early scans showing that kind of detail, the way there sometimes is now. But when Henry started coming through on that board, telling her he hated her living son, telling her she was supposed to be his mother instead of mine, it landed on something that already existed as an open wound in her, something she hadn't processed and hadn't found language for. She stopped using the board not long after that. She told me she got scared, genuinely scared, the kind of fear that made her pack the board away somewhere she wouldn't have to look at it, and eventually she got rid of it entirely. Though she was fuzzy on the details of exactly how, whether she threw it out or burned it or gave it away to someone who didn't know its history. She just wanted it gone. That was the story as I first heard it from her, years and years after it happened, told in bits and pieces the way most family stories get told. Never all at once, never with every detail lined up perfectly, but consistent enough across the retellings that I never doubted she believed every word of it herself. Now about 14 years passed between those Ouija board sessions and the next part of this story. 14 years of ordinary life, or what looked like ordinary life from the outside, at least. During that time, my mother went to see a psychic. This wasn't something she did casually or as a matter of habit. She had never believed in psychics before that, had always been mildly dismissive of the whole idea. The sort of person who rolled her eyes at daytime television mediums and thought the whole industry preyed on grieving, desperate people. She went that day mostly on a whim, dragged along by a friend who wanted company, more out of politeness than genuine interest in what the woman might have to say. The psychic, according to my mother, didn't know anything about her beforehand, no information passed along by the friend, no obvious research done ahead of time. Just a stranger sitting across a small table from her in a room that smelled like incense. Early into the reading, the psychic told my mother something that made the hair stand up on her arms immediately. She said my mother was supposed to have had 3 children. Not 2, not an approximate guess, but 3, specifically, stated with a kind of certainty that caught my mother completely off guard. Because at that point, she'd had exactly 2 pregnancies that made it to full term. Myself and my younger sibling, plus the miscarriage she'd never told this woman about. Never told almost anyone about. A private grief she kept close, and rarely spoke of even to close family. The psychic then asked her directly if she had an older teenage son. Me, and when my mother confirmed that she did, the psychic told her something that made my mother's blood run cold sitting there in that small, incense-heavy room. She said there had been a vengeful spirit of a child following that son around for years upon years, ever since he was very young. A presence that had attached itself to me early in my life and had never fully let go. The psychic reportedly went further than that, too, describing a restless energy that she said followed me specifically into rooms that seemed to grow more active during moments of stress or change in my life, though my mother could never remember the exact wording later, only the general shape of what she'd been told, and the overwhelming feeling of dread that settled over her as she listened. My mother didn't tell the psychic anything about the Ouija board sessions from over a decade earlier. She hadn't planned on bringing any of that up at all. But sitting there, hearing this stranger describe a vengeful child spirit connected to me, connected to a pregnancy she'd lost right around the time I was born, she couldn't help but think immediately of Henry, of that name she hadn't spoken out loud in years, of the things that Presence had told her all that time ago about hating me, about stealing his place in the world. I want to step back here and explain what my own life had actually looked like during those 14 years. Because this is the part of the story that still unsettles me the most when I think about it now as an adult, looking back with the added context my mother eventually gave me about Henry and the board and everything else. For as long as I can remember, going back to some of my very earliest childhood memories, I heard things in whatever house we were living in at the time. Voices, low and indistinct, coming from empty rooms. Scratching sounds inside the walls, the kind that didn't match any explanation involving mice or pipes or settling wood, because they had a rhythm to them sometimes, a pattern that felt too deliberate to be random structural noise. Footsteps in hallways when nobody else was up, when I knew for a fact my parents and siblings were all asleep in their rooms. Shadows moving at the edges of my vision, the kind you catch out of the corner of your eye and turn to look at directly, only to find nothing there, just an empty corner of the room or a stretch of blank wall. I grew up thinking, for a long time, that this was just a normal part of being a kid, that everyone experienced these things to some degree and either grew out of them or learned to stop paying attention. It wasn't until I was older, comparing notes with friends about childhood memories, that I realized how unusual it actually was to have that consistent, ongoing thread of unexplained experiences running through basically my entire childhood. Not isolated incidents you could chalk up to imagination or a single bad dream, but a persistent, years-long pattern. I grew up thinking for a long time that this was just a normal part of being a kid, that everyone experienced these things to some degree and either grew out of them or learned to stop paying attention. It wasn't until I was older, comparing notes with friends about childhood memories, that I realized how unusual it actually was to have that consistent, ongoing thread of unexplained experiences running through basically my entire childhood. Not isolated incidents you could chalk up to imagination or a single bad dream, but a persistent years-long pattern. I remember one specific stretch of time, when I was around 9 or 10, where the footsteps became almost a nightly occurrence. I'd be lying in bed, unable to sleep, and I'd hear them start in the hallway, just outside my door. Slow and deliberate, pausing every so often like whoever was making them was listening for something, waiting to see if I would react. I never had the courage to open the door and check. I'd just lie there, frozen under my blankets, counting the steps as they moved back and forth, sometimes for what felt like 10 or 15 minutes at a stretch, before they finally faded away and the house went quiet again. I never told my parents about most of these nights, not at the time. It felt somehow like something I was supposed to keep to myself, a private, unspoken relationship between me and whatever was in that hallway. One I didn't fully understand and couldn't have explained even if I'd tried. There's one specific memory from very early childhood that stands out above all the others, one that I didn't fully understand the weight of until much later, when my parents finally told me the rest of the story behind it. When I was very young enough that most of my other memories from that age are hazy and fragmented at best, I used to talk to what I called the black man. That's how I referred to him, a black man, someone I described to my parents as a presence I interacted with, though I don't have clear memories now of what exactly those interactions looked like, or what he said to me, if he said anything at all. What I do remember, faintly, is a feeling of familiarity around him. Not fear, exactly. More like the kind of comfortable recognition you'd have around an adult who was simply always around. A fixture of the house, rather than something frightening. My parents didn't think much of it at first, the way parents often don't think much of imaginary friends, assuming it was just a normal part of early childhood development, kids inventing companions to fill quiet hours alone in their rooms. Plenty of toddlers talk to invisible friends, give them names, set places for them at the table. And most parents brush it off as harmless imagination that will fade with time. My parents assumed the same thing at first, humoring me when I mentioned him, never pushing too hard for details, treating it the same way they'd treat any other phase of early development. But at some point, my description of this figure became specific enough, detailed enough, that it started to unsettle them. I described his build, his features, small specific details about his appearance that felt too consistent and too particular for a purely invented character a toddler might dream up on their own. My parents eventually pieced together who I was describing, and when they did, it stopped feeling like ordinary childhood imagination and started feeling like something else entirely. The description matched, almost exactly, the appearance of our landlord's husband, a man who had died years before we ever moved into that house, killed in an accident while doing repair work on the property itself. He had, from what my parents were eventually told, fallen while working on part of the roof, an accident that happened quickly and left the landlord a widow years before she ever considered renting the place out to a family like ours. I never met this man. He died long before my family signed the lease, long before I was even born in some tellings of the timeline. Depending on exactly how the years lined up, and there were no photographs of him displayed anywhere in the house for me to have seen and unconsciously absorbed. There was no reasonable way for a toddler to know what this specific deceased stranger had looked like, and yet I had described him closely enough, consistently enough, that my parents were able to identify exactly who I meant once they started asking around and eventually got a description or a photograph from the landlord herself. My mother told me she felt a cold wave pass over her the moment the landlord confirmed the details matched, standing in the kitchen of that house, holding an old photograph while I sat nearby, completely unbothered. Still young enough that the conversation happening around me meant nothing at all. Knowing that now, as an adult, changes the way I look back on that fuzzy, half-remembered childhood friendship with the black man. It's strange to think that some of my earliest interactions, memories too faint now to fully recall in detail, were with a man who had died on the very property where we lived, doing work on the same walls and floors I grew up walking through every day. I don't know if he meant me any harm. If anything, the vague impression I still carry from those early years is one of mild comfort, not menace, which makes him feel separate somehow from the other things that happened in that house and the houses that came after it. The footsteps and scratching and shadows that never felt comfortable or familiar the way my early memories of him did. My mother told me once that she asked the landlord very carefully whether there had ever been any strange occurrences reported in the house before we moved in, whether any other tenants had ever mentioned anything unusual. The landlord admitted, somewhat reluctantly, that a previous family had moved out earlier than their lease was supposed to end, citing vague reasons that never quite added up. Something about the commute being too long, though the landlord always suspected there was more to it that the family simply didn't want to discuss. Nobody ever gave a clear account of what, if anything, had actually happened to them in that house, but the fact that it had happened before, that we weren't the first family to leave that property feeling unsettled, added another layer to a story that already felt heavy enough on its own. Henry is a different story entirely. Whatever attached itself to me around the time of my mother's miscarriage, whatever spoke through that Ouija board and told her again and again how much it hated me and resented my existence, feels like a completely separate presence from the quiet, familiar figure of the black man. If the psychic was right, if there really has been a vengeful child spirit following me for years upon years, then Henry is the far more likely candidate for the source of everything else. The footsteps, the scratching, the voices, the sense some nights of not being entirely alone in a room that should have been empty. My mother has apologized to me more than once over the years for ever bringing that board into our home in the first place, even though logically she knows there was no way for her to have predicted any of what followed from a purchase that felt, at the time, like nothing more than idle curiosity. I've told her repeatedly that she has nothing to apologize for, that she couldn't have known. But I understand why the guilt lingers for her regardless. She carries the weight of feeling responsible for opening some kind of door that she was never able to fully close again, no matter how many years passed, no matter how far removed we eventually got from that specific house and those specific sessions with the board. I've never sat down with a Ouija board myself. Not once in my entire life. My mother made sure of that early on, telling me the full story as soon as she felt I was old enough to understand it, warning me away from ever trying to make that kind of contact myself. Worried about what might happen if I tried to reach out directly to whatever had been following me all these years. I've respected that boundary completely, even during periods in my teenage years when curiosity got the better of some of my friends, and they wanted to try it themselves at sleepovers, using cheap boards bought from novelty shops as a way to scare themselves for fun. I always found an excuse to sit those sessions out, watching from the edge of the room instead, telling myself it was just superstition, just an old family story that didn't need to control how I lived my adult life, while some quieter part of me refused to take the risk regardless. There was one night, though, that still bothers me more than I like to admit, from a sleepover when I was around 16. I wasn't the one holding the planchette. I'd stayed firmly on the sidelines, like always. But partway through the session, one of my friends asked the board directly if there was anyone else in the room it wanted to talk about. The planchette moved, slowly at first, and then with more confidence, spelling out a single word before anyone could stop it. Henry. None of my friends knew that name. I had never told any of them about my mother's story, had never even hinted at it, wanting to keep that part of my life separate from ordinary teenage friendships and sleepovers. I left the room immediately, made some excuse about needing air, and sat outside on the porch steps for the rest of the night, refusing to go back in no matter how much they teased me about it afterward. I never told them why. I've never told anyone outside my immediate family the full weight of what that single word meant to me in that moment. I still hear things sometimes, even now, in whatever place I happen to be living. Not as often as when I was a kid, and not always as intensely, but often enough that I've never fully been able to convince myself that whatever followed me through childhood simply stopped one day and left me alone for good. A scratch in the wall, late at night. A shadow at the edge of a doorway that resolves into nothing when I turn to look directly at it. A creak of footsteps in an empty hallway when everyone else in the house is asleep. Just last year, living in an apartment far away from any of the houses I grew up in, I woke up around 3 in the morning to the distinct sound of my bedroom door creaking open. Slow and deliberate, the exact same pace and pitch as the footsteps I used to hear in the hallway of my childhood home decades earlier. I lay there frozen, staring at the door, waiting to see if it would open further, waiting for some shape to appear in the gap between the door and the frame. Nothing did. After a few minutes, the door simply creaked shut again on its own, with no draft in the room to explain it. No open window. Nothing that could account for a door moving entirely by itself in a room with no airflow strong enough to push it even slightly off its resting position. I didn't sleep again that night. I lay there thinking about Henry, about the psychic's warning, about a resentment that apparently has no expiration date, no matter how many years or how many miles separate me from where it all supposedly began. I don't know if it's Henry, still resentful after all these years, still convinced somewhere in whatever form he exists in now that I took something from him that should have been his. I don't know if it's something else entirely, drawn to whatever it is about me that seems to attract these kinds of experiences in the first place. All I know is that my mother's story about a Ouija board she bought on a whim when I was 2 years old was never just a strange anecdote from before I could remember. It was the beginning of something that has followed me my entire life, quietly, patiently, in the walls and hallways and dark corners of every house I've ever lived in since. Sometimes I think about that psychic's office, about the specific details she gave without any prompting, that my mother was supposed to have had 3 children. It's such a strange, specific thing for a stranger to say to someone she'd never met before. And it's the detail that convinces me, more than anything else in this entire story, that something real was being picked up on that day. Some genuine thread connecting my mother's grief, my own childhood experiences, and whatever it was that first came through that board when I was too young to remember any of it happening. I wasn't there for those original sessions. I have no memory of Henry's voice, no memory of the planchette moving under my mother's fingers, no memory of any of it firsthand. And yet, I've spent my entire life living in the aftermath of those few strange nights, carrying the weight of a resentment I never asked for, from a sibling I never got the chance to know. Born from a loss, my mother has never fully stopped grieving. Even now, decades later, whenever the subject happens to come up,